Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was strange arriving in the small rural Montana town that was wearing an antique cloak of yesteryear, as if not much had changed over the centuries. Although some of the vintage-looking shops hinted at a peppering of modern touches that persuaded Gemma that perhaps the town had moved forwards into modern times after all, with a reticent, wary reluctance, like a mule plodding along, carrying a heavy weight on its back, and not being desperately enthusiastic to move forwards. It was almost as if every wooden or stone building was completely set in its ways, like some of the older cranky residents of this town, many who understandably really didn't fancy doing things differently, or embracing change that was too dramatic for them to stomach. Some clearly looked on the persuasion of modern influences with a sceptical, rather cautious suspicion. The town was postcard perfect, and as pretty as a picture, in a rustic town and country sort of way. There was no doubt about that, as large keg barrels were tumbling over with vibrant red and pink hanging geraniums, as colour splashed itself magnanimously around the town, announcing to anybody that would notice or listen that summer had at long last arrived, and the general spirited ambience suggested many had heeded its call, as residents abandoned their parkas and winter sweaters like the skins of an old onion, and were thoroughly enjoying the sun's golden promises. Gemma was so grateful for that, for she'd never been the type of person that enjoyed cold weather. In another lifetime she'd obviously been a salamander. If she could have her way, she'd lie contentedly in the sun, like a cat soaking in the warm sunshine, on a sun lounger all day long, if given the chance or opportunity. But these days the tanned look was out of fashion, and invited you the promise of skin cancer and early onset aging, two things that Gemma would like to avoid like the plague. Winter in New York had not been a pleasant experience, especially after her father's fortuitous tragic passing that she'd never ever seen coming. Her dad's death had certainly hit her hard, like a bolt out of the blue, or a random chance encounter with a lightning strike. It would seem the frigidly cold, inauspicious, austere days of winter had been foreboding, grey, incredibly depressing. So the bright blue Montana skies, with the complementary viridescent rolling countryside, had been a welcoming sight for Gemma when she'd arrived in the small town. But she sensed she'd likely feel like a fish out of water around these parts, and she wasn't altogether sure how she'd be perceived by the locals. Ostensibly, Gemma had never really concerned herself about the opinions of others. Was not life tough enough already, without worrying about things that you certainly could not change? Gemma was not sure she'd be welcome in this quaint Montana town, where people were acquainted with each other's shadows and knew what their neighbour was wearing to church the previous Sunday. There was no doubt in her mind that new faces were probably regarded with grave suspicion. So a strange woman asking uncomfortable, awkward questions about a curious missing persons case that had happened in the 1980s was possibly going to go down like a lead balloon here. People did not like mysterious small-town secrets being unearthed by nosy intruders, putting their nose into a case that was as cold as the ice in Antarctica. When Gemma had by chance stumbled across an old newspaper article, her curiosity had been piqued, and she was eager to find answers to a plethora of questions that had plagued her of late, because indirectly those questions concerned her, in a manner of speaking. It was only after her father's sudden death, which had thrown the world as she knew it precariously off its axis, so she felt she'd lost all sense of her bearings, rather like a migratory bird, no longer remembering its flying route, or being able to pick up the Earth's magnetic signals, to navigate its migratory path clearly. Gemma felt equally as unhinged and disconnected to everything, for losing the only remaining member of her family had left her dreadfully alone in the world, as if she was abandoned on a desert island, and now was going to have to fend all for herself, and face the challenges that came her way single-handedly. It was good to have friends, of course, and Gemma had 3 very good friends, but blood was thicker than water, and without her only surviving blood relative around, the rosy glow of security and safety that had surrounded her life for as long as she could remember had dissipated after her dad's death, just like the smoke from a chimney. She knew without him around she'd never, ever feel the same again, for a small part of her was now broken. It was a pity that some injuries could never be physically fixed, for they were the emotional abrasions of the heart that were not so quick to heal, and Gemma was certain that she'd never get over her dad's grievous loss. She missed him so dreadfully. She couldn't understand why other people's parents seemed to live long lifetimes, but her family on both sides seemed to have been strategically pinpointed for an early exit from this planet, and she couldn't understand why. Sometimes life seemed grossly unfair, but her father would always remind her that in everything there will always be a divine justice, but that never brought Gemma much comfort. As for one thing, she didn't know what her father had meant at the time. She thought he was implying that if someone gets 6 Smarties in life, and someone gets 2, in the end things would balance out. Gemma had never grown up with a mother that she could remember, because the first year of your life is not something a baby should ever recall. Gemma's father had told her when she was old enough to understand that her mother had died tragically in a car accident, and that was all she had known about her mother, Samantha Bowen, whom everyone called Sammy for short. It had been devastating to learn that a year after she'd been born, her mother had exited this planet and was now gone for good like a piece of chaff floating away on the wind. It would seem her father had been so annoyingly vague about the details concerning her mother's death. So Gemma had made many assumptions concerning her mother, many of them false, because that's what you do when you try to fill in all the blanks. It was natural for a young girl to want to know all there was to know about her birth mother, the mystery woman who had brought her into the world. Gemma's father had never been forthcoming with any information, especially when it concerned the subject of her mother's death, which was a subject he chose to be very evasive about. "How did she die?" Gemma would ask him when she was a little girl, her ears burning to hear anything her father had to say about the mysterious woman she had yearned to know. She would stare into her father's big brown eyes, not unlike her own, and observe her face reflected in his steely gaze. Mr. Bowen rigidly kept himself to himself, loathing nothing more than people intruding on his personal space and privacy. Even his daughter asking him intrusive questions he did not wish to answer was a bone of contention for the man. Mr. Bowen would frown, the corner of his lips turning downwards, and there'd be a sorrowful glint in his eyes that would pull at Gemma's heartstrings. But she had to ask her dad these questions, or otherwise she'd look on her mother as a blank canvas in her life that could never be filled.
"Gemma, I don't know how many times we've gone over this. You've asked me this question 100 times over, and I keep giving you the same answer. I told you that your mother was tragically killed in a car accident. Her car slammed into a tree. She was driving with a friend. Her friend was driving the car. Now let's change the subject, shall we? Death is not a subject we should be focusing on. It's the here and now that matters. It's not healthy. Let us talk about brighter things, shall we not?
But what was Mummy like, Daddy? Gemma would ask. Was she pretty?
Her father would sigh, rub his chin reflectively, in a self-soothing gesture that he would always adopt when he was feeling a tad uncomfortable. There is a lot more to a person, my dear, than just being pretty, he would say. For a moment there'd be a wistful, faraway look in his eyes, and Gemma could tell that her mother had been the quintessential love of his life. That nostalgic look of longing said it all. Of course your mother was pretty, he would say, but she was much, much, much more than a pretty face. She had the grace of a gazelle, the inquisitiveness of a squirrel, and the heart of a lion. And that was all her father would reveal to Gemma about her mother. But Gemma knew that there was no greater compliment than that. What could be better than having the grace of a gazelle and the heart of a lion? But the inquisitiveness of a squirrel was a trait that she too had surely inherited from her mother, and she wasn't certain that this was such a blessing, as Gemma liked to inquire about absolutely everything, if given the chance and opportunity. Growing up as a young girl, she was always the kid in the classroom, raising her arm up enthusiastically to ask question after question.
But miss, she'd say, if geese really do only have one partner for life, what happens when their mate dies?
She would challenge the teachers with questions they sometimes could not answer. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question for you, Gemma, because like every human being on this planet, even animals are uniquely different with their own personalities, and I'm quite sure they all react to life very differently. Some geese might die of a broken heart. I'm sure that must happen. I've seen it in animals in nature all the time. It's not impossible. Others might live on their own and carry on till the rest of their lives. And maybe some find a new mate. But by nature they are loyal to one partner for their entire lives. And we would do well to learn from their example. There are far too many divorces in America. We need to stick by each other in marriage. And the goose might teach us a lot from that. When Gemma was 8, her father married a woman called Estelle Wagner, who moved into their apartment in Manhattan for about 8 years, where she'd become like a mother to Gemma. Her father had met Estelle at the library, when returning overdue library books, and Estelle, who had been a head librarian, had waived all his fines. I tell you what, Mr. Barton, you can take me out for a drink sometime, and I won't charge you for overdue fees for your late books. Have we got a deal or not? Mr. Barton had smiled warmly at her. Sounds like a jolly good idea to me, he said. How can I possibly refuse that? I know an excellent place where we can go. They make particularly good pina coladas there, and they do a mean, juicy burger. Estelle had raised a quizzical brow. Sounds like I'm getting a very good deal myself there, she said. If you're including a meal in the offer, then how can I refuse such a tempting opportunity? That had been the beginning of the couple's budding romantic relationship, and before long Gemma's father had introduced Estelle to her. Estelle was a shrewd woman, who had always been attracted to Mr. Barton since he had visited the library in Manhattan. One of her good friends working at the library had told Estelle to ask Mr. Barton on a date. If you don't, she warned her friend, that ship will pass you by in the night, and the only thing you will ever feel is regret. You need to be like an assertive cat that pounces on its prey. Mr. Barton is the kind of man you need to chase after yourself, and if you don't, somebody else will do it for you, and they'll get the prize, and you'll lose out. So if you want my advice, you go and ask him for a date. Estelle needed little encouragement, and had used the late overdue library books as an excuse to start dating Mr. Barton. She had been so incredibly successful in her endeavours that 12 months later they had been married, and Gemma had welcomed her stepmother in her home, despite all her friends warning her that stepmothers could be very evil.
In all the fairy tales that you read about, they always warn about the wicked stepmother.
But Estelle had been anything but a wicked stepmother. On the contrary, Estelle had brought those much-needed feminine touches into their lives,
and had turned her father's man cave into a sumptuous, cosy, beautiful home, and beyond that had been a devoted stepmother to Gemma. It had been wonderful going shopping with Estelle to buy pretty things from the store, going to the beach with her when they went away, and to talk to about girls' things. She had someone always to confide in. One day Gemma came home from school to find Estelle in tears. She had never seen the woman in such a state before, and was mortified to see Estelle was piling her suitcases with clothes. The woman wasn't even looking at what she was doing. She was blinded by her own tears, and randomly flinging her stuff into suitcases as if she couldn't leave the apartment fast enough. She looked incredibly distressed, and Gemma's heart broke for her, because she knew that something was terribly wrong, and this was the kind of wrong she sensed could never be righted.
"Where are you going, Estelle? Why are you packing your suitcases like that? You're not leaving us. Please, don't tell me you're leaving us. You can't leave us," she had asked, her heart heavy with trepidation, for she could discern that Estelle was obviously leaving them, and she knew with Estelle gone she'd be left with a huge hole in her life that could never be filled, as Estelle had been a good mother to her over the last 8 years. "What does it look like, Gemma? I'm leaving for good, I'm afraid. I really don't want to do this to you, of all people, because I love you dearly. You're very special to me, and I don't want to hurt you. But I've got no choice in the matter, if I want to preserve my dignity, that is. Leaving your father is the right thing to do. You have no idea, Gemma, what it is like to be compared with a dead woman every day of my life. Your father always describes your mother as having the heart of a lion and the grace of a gazelle. I've never known him to speak so tenderly about me, the way he speaks of your late mother. Do you know, not even once has he ever told me he loves me, not once. Do you have any idea how that feels? It's just so devastating, Gemma. I've waited 8 years for 3 words to come out of his mouth, and no such luck. Your father has never uttered them even once. He's never even told me he appreciates me, Gemma. Do you know how soul-destroying that is?
My dad has never ever told you he loves you, and you've been together with him for 8 years. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? No, I'm not, Gemma, I'm afraid. It is true. I don't know what to say, Estelle. I'm so sorry. But you know what my father's like.
I do know what he's like. I've been with him for 8 years. I think I should know. I feel as if I'd been hammering away at a hardened coconut for years and years, and never cracking it open to get to the sweet coconut milk. I really thought I'd be able to open him up, you know, Gemma. I cannot believe I was such a dreadful fool. I thought I'd get through to the man hiding beneath the reticent, insouciant veneer that he shows to the rest of the world. But how wrong I was about that. I thought I'd be the one that would get through to him, open up his heart, help him to love again. Your father has been a closed book all his life, and I've had enough, Gemma. I've had enough. I need more in a relationship than your father is willing to give. Someone who's prepared to love me for myself, to make me feel beautiful and valued and important. But your father doesn't appreciate that I need these things in my life. And in a relationship with your father, I've begun to feel vacuously empty inside, as if I'm just a fly on the wall that he barely notices and would probably like to squat if given the chance.
Did you not tell him how you feel? Gemma asked. I mean, if it makes you feel any better, Daddy doesn't tell me very often that he loves me either. But I unequivocally know he does, and that he would do absolutely anything for me. And I'm sure the same can be said for you. He probably thinks, based on the kind things that he does for us, that he's showing us love without using words to articulate his feelings. That's probably what this is all about.
Of course I told him, Gemma, exactly how I felt. I told him he'd never told me he loves me. Do you know what he said to me, Gemma?
Gemma drew in a deep breath. What did he say? She asked, although she didn't want to hear what Estelle was going to say next.
Your father told me he's always liked me, that he was terribly fond of me, and that we're very good friends. After 8 years, Gemma, he's only fond of me. When he told me that, I was furiously angry. I wanted to slap him across the face. After all I've done for him, he's only fond of me, fond of me. I mean, isn't that a joke? I'd laugh if it wasn't so crazy.
He said that to you? Said Gemma. He just told you he liked you and was fond of you, and that you were good friends? That's crazy. You've been living together for the last 8 years. I'm sure he loves you, Estelle, but I know he's got a funny way of showing it. Although you know what he's like, he's not exactly the kind of man who wears his heart on his sleeve. My father is complicated, hard to figure out at the best of times. I've struggled to understand him my entire life. I should know.
That's the problem, Gemma. I don't think your father will ever acknowledge he loves me, and I need him to do that. I can't live in a marriage where I'm not made to feel appreciated and cherished. I'm sure you can understand how I feel. And I know he's not going to change, Gemma. And I'm sorry after 8 years I'd like a husband to say that he actually loves me. Is that too much to ask, Gemma? Do you think I'm being unreasonable?
She said, blowing her straight, pert little nose into a large man-sized tissue, and using her thumbs to wipe away a couple of stray tears rolling down her cheeks.
Of course you're not being unreasonable, said Gemma. I'm angry with my father for treating you like this, Estelle. Sometimes I can't figure him out. You're the best thing that has ever happened in our lives, and I don't say that lightly. I mean it. Before you came along, we were eating baked beans and miserable burnt offerings, and ordering takeout every second day. And when you arrived in our lives like a rainbow from heaven, our lives took on a positive turn, with home-cooked delicious meals, exciting camping holidays, incredible shopping trips, and then there's all you've done to the house to make it a real home for us. If you go, life is going to be so dull.
Gemma pulled a face.
Please, Estelle, please, please, please don't go, she said obsequiously. Dad and I really need you. Besides, you do love him, don't you? That's the problem, Gemma. I love you and your dad more than anything else in the world. Then why don't you stay, Estelle? I don't want you to go, said Gemma, breaking into tears, and grabbing Estelle for dear life, as if afraid to let her go. My mum left me, Estelle, when I was little, when I was only 1 year old. And now you want to go. Why does everyone I love leave me? It's not fair. That's the problem, Gemma. That's one thing I've learnt. Life isn't fair. It never is. And we have to learn to accept that.
She took the teenager into her arms, that she considered like a beloved daughter to her, cupping her head in her hands.
Now you listen to me, Gemma, and you listen good. I'm leaving your father, but I am not leaving you. I am never, and I mean never, leaving you. In my eyes, you are my daughter. The fact that you aren't my daughter by blood is neither here nor there. It's the same to me. In my eyes, you are 100% my little girl, and I will remain involved in your life as if I have never left you. Do you understand? Nothing in that regard will ever change. I'll be living under another roof. I'm actually moving in with my sister. She's never married and could do well with the companionship, so it's going to work out fine for us. And you can visit as often as you like. We're literally a 5-minute walk away from here. You need to appreciate, Gemma dear, that I'm not prepared to play second fiddle a moment longer to your late mother. It's a joke, it is, and I'm sure you understand that. Your father puts your late mother on a pedestal, as if she could do nothing wrong, as if she's some kind of angelic entity that has never sinned in her entire life, which is ridiculous because she is as human as the rest of us. Well, she was when she was alive. It's her picture he's kept in her wallet all these years, never mine. I think that's telling enough, don't you?
You deserve better, Estelle.
You are right,
Gemma admitted. The two women had held each other tightly and wept.
You'll always be my little girl, Gemma, Estelle had said. I'm your mother, don't you ever forget that, and you're my daughter. So if you need something, I will be down the road from you, and you can call me 1,000 times a day if you like. I won't mind at all. In fact, I will be delighted to hear from you. I'll always have time for you, Gemma dear."
When Estelle had left their family home, she'd filed for divorce, and it had been tough and hard going for Gemma, but she soon adjusted to the change in their living arrangements. She'd meet up with Estelle 3 days a week, and regularly walk to Estelle's sister's apartment for a chat, and sometimes stay overnight at the apartment. And Estelle had made her up a perfectly beautiful bedroom. It would seem her father prodded along nonchalantly with life, as if nothing had happened, as if the dramatic change in their lifestyle and circumstances was simply water off a duck's back to him. He didn't seem desperately upset or aggrieved that Estelle had left their lives, and his insouciance and apathetic indifference had made Gemma absolutely furious. "What is wrong with you, Dad?" she said one evening over the dinner table, as she ferreted around the Chinese takeaway box to retrieve a helping of chicken chow mein, which she deposited on a cold plate. And now, with no one preparing meals for them, they were living on take-out. She was unable to contain her indignance. She threw down her chopsticks onto the table, glaring defiantly at her father like an angry cat that was about to lash out at him with her razor-sharp claws. "Look how we're living now, Dad, without Estelle around. We're living like absolute pigs. Your clothes are everywhere, over every single floor, over all the furniture. Our kitchen looks like a bomb has hit it. And I'm expected to do all the cleaning because you refused to lift a finger. Why did you not tell Estelle you loved her, Dad? Then we'd be one happy family together. What's wrong with you? Why are you so emotionally redundant? It was so good having Estelle around. She was a brilliant mother to me, and a fabulous wife to you, and I don't think you saw that. You couldn't have had a more devoted woman at your side, and yet you never appreciated everything she did for you and for us. She loved us both so much. I feel as if our lives have come crumbling down with the forceful ferocity of a wrecking ball. All Estelle needed from you was love, Dad, and for you to express it a little from time to time. But was that too hard for you, to give her what she needed? Estelle was good to us, Dad. I'm surprised you did not see that. She was a mother I never had, and she made my life richer for knowing her. And you've thrown all that away because you're so proud, far too proud to tell her you love her. You know what, Dad? You make me sick to my stomach. I'm ashamed to call you my father. It was abuse the way you treated her. Abuse, nothing less and nothing more. You know not telling her you love her is that. It's abuse. I'm sorry to say it, but that's how I feel. Estelle deserved so much better than you. How could you have been so heartless, so cruel, so cold, so indifferent?
Gemma, you make some very good points there, and I'm sorry to have upset you. And it grieves me that I couldn't give Estelle what she needed emotionally. But I've never been in love with the woman. Would you really want me to lie to her? To tell her what she wants to hear? I respect her too much for that, and in my opinion that would be treacherous. I was fond of Estelle. A very good woman she was. We were great companions when we got married. I thought she didn't want to be alone. A lot of people don't want to be lonely after they've lost a spouse. So they get reacquainted with somebody else, and both of them come together. In friendship they do, so that they don't have to be alone. And that was the idea. That is the reason I got together with Estelle. But she wanted so much more from me than I was prepared to give. I couldn't give my heart to her completely. It belonged to another. She could never have replaced your mother. Your mother I loved unconditionally. My heart is reserved for her and for you. That's the way it'll always be. Estelle was a good friend. She was there for me as a friend. That's how I saw it. You see, from the first day I met your mother, Gemma, I knew she was the one. There is no one out there that could take her place. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? I think you're like a goose, Dad, Gemma had said. Gemma's father had raised a brow. A goose? What are you talking about, Gemma? Sometimes you speak in riddles. It's impossible to understand what you're trying to say. Gemma grinned. "We discussed it in class once when I was at school years ago. I think it was Mrs. Wallace's class, if I'm right. Do you know geese are faithful to one partner for life?" "Well, there you go then," said her father, giving his daughter a bashful smile. "I'm a goose, and I'm proud of it. It's better to be a goose than a rabbit, don't you think? Rabbits are notorious for getting frisky with so many partners, as many as possible. Me, I'm loyal to a T. And I can't help myself, but that's the way I am, and I'm not ashamed of it at all." "Of course it's better to be a goose," said Gemma. "I hope the man I marry one day will be a goose, faithful to me alone. But I wouldn't like to be with a goose that's loved his previous partner and overlooked me, like you did with Estelle. That would be a real bummer. I understand why Estelle left you. I really do. I hope you don't mind my saying that." "You're right, Gemma. It's a good job she did. She needed way better than I was prepared to give her, and I hope she gets it. I mean, we would have been happy together if she just wanted to remain friends and go about the things the way we always did. But she wanted so much more from me. So I hope she meets someone who can give her the love she deserves. She's a good woman."
Gemma realised from her father's revelatory comments that no other woman would ever be able to fill her mother's shoes, as far as her dad was concerned. And that was the way it would always be. She needed to accept that her dad was devotedly loyal, like an old English sheepdog hanging around its owner's grave long after its owner has died. And even though it might be rehomed and even adopted, it'll never be able to replace its original owner, its first love. That was the way it was for Gemma's father. She had kept a picture of her mother by her bedside table, and would lovingly stroke her mother's face from time to time, and talk tenderly to the unresponsive, fixed photograph. "What were you like, Mama?" she would ask the picture. "I wish I knew you. I wish I'd known you in my life. I so wish you hadn't gone away from us. I wish you had been my mother." But the girl in the picture with the shoulder-length chestnut brown hair and hazel eyes would not respond, but only smiled brightly back into the photograph, holding in her arms an adorable black Scottish terrier that Gemma learnt was called Bobo. The photograph did not speak back to her. It did not answer the question she longed to ask. For years, over the course of her young life, she had regularly visited a grave site at the cemetery, where her father would one day be buried with her mother. But it was after his death that she learnt that her mother's body had never been buried in that double burial plot that her father had purchased. The grave she had visited as a girl, where she had laid flowers for so long, had in fact been empty all the time. And the granite large gravestone that had been erected was a memorial to her mother. It left her wondering what had become of her mother's remains. But then she realised maybe her mother had been cremated and requested a burial site for himself, and a double plot at that. That part made no sense to Gemma at all. One day when Gemma returned from work, she was to discover her dad sitting upright in his weathered wing chair that had faded from far too much sunshine, and that Estelle, her stepmother, had longed to get reupholstered, but her father had staunchly refused to allow the chair to ever be recovered, as it had belonged to his late father, and he was very attached to it, as if his father's essence remained embedded in the old fabric. When Gemma entered the living room that day, the television was on static. She had known at once that something was terribly wrong. Even though Gemma was in her 30s, she had chosen to remain living with her father in his apartment, so she was well acquainted with his quirky ways. For her, seeing him sitting upright in a chair just staring blankly into space made no sense at all. It had been airy. He'd never have tolerated a static reception like this for even a moment. His eyes appeared to be glazed over. "Dad! Wake up, will you?" she said, rushing hurriedly over to him, her heart dipping in her chest like an escalator on a downward trajectory. "For goodness sake, wake up, Dad!" But when she rushed over to him and touched his body slumped to one side, and Gemma had screamed so loudly that the next-door neighbour had called the police at once, believing that Gemma was being murdered. Gemma had been shaking so much, when she came to the horrifying realization that her father was dead. There was nothing she could do to revive him. He was out cold, and she suspected he'd had a heart attack. Her suspicions were later confirmed by the medical examiner, who described her father's heart as being very enlarged. Nothing prepared her for the hopelessness that would cling to her life, like a tick on a dog's back, not easily shaken off by any manner of means. Certainly, if it had not been for Estelle's loving support, Gemma did not know how she would have coped or got through this tragedy with her father gone so needlessly from her life. She had felt conspicuously alone, and after he was laid to rest, she never left the apartment for a whole 2 weeks. Her grief was so great. It was Estelle who pulled her out of the muddy mire of her lugubrious melancholia and helped her to get back on her feet again, bringing her hearty meals and watching televisions with her. Estelle had been so gentle, kind and loving, and equally as devastated to learn of her late husband's passing. Estelle still lived with her sister and had never remarried. She remained hopelessly in love with a man who had been incapable of reciprocating that love. "Sweetheart," she'd said to Gemma tenderly, taking her daughter in her arms, even though Gemma was no longer a little girl. After her father died, it felt as if she'd reverted to being a little girl all over again. "You know your father loved you with all his heart, but he'd hate to see you like this. You look a dreadful mess, my girl. It would break his heart to see you in so much despair. You need to get it together, have a bath, brush your hair, take care of yourself." "But I'm all alone in the world," Gemma had cried. "Don't you understand, Estelle? I have no one any more. No one at all." "Where did you get that idea from, Gemma? You do only half talk nonsense sometimes. You listen to me, girl, and you listen hard," said Estelle, putting her hand under Gemma's chin and tenderly cupping her face, her blue eyes holding Gemma's gaze. "You are never alone. You hear me? I'm always here for you, no matter what. Do you understand that? I may not be your biological mother by blood, but I am in heart, and nothing can change that. I have always considered myself to be your mother, and as I say, I'm always here for you. I may not have officially adopted you, but you're my little girl, no matter how old you become." Estelle's magnanimous words had been heartening, warming the cockles of Gemma's heart, and she knew it was true, and that no matter what hurdles life threw their way, that stepmother and stepdaughter would always remain incredibly close. The generation gap between the two of them was insignificant, and in recent years had melted away like butter, so that they had become closer than ever. Estelle was more than a mother to her, but her very best, most beloved friend. It was Estelle who'd encouraged Gemma to sort through her dad's stuff. "You don't need to sell your father's apartment, and if you want the honest truth, I don't think you should. It's located in a magnificent part of Manhattan, and it's a fabulous investment, and I would keep it if I were you. But the one thing you don't want to do is to live in the past, and your father's stuff lying all over the place is going to make you do just that. I can help you sort out some of his things if you like. We'll go through all the supercilious items, donate his clothes to charity. What do you think?" "I think you're right," Gemma had admitted. "It's a job I've been putting off, but it needs to be done. I guess I was so worried that I'd just break down in tears, having to sort his stuff out. But you're right. I have to get rid of it." Gemma had been so grateful. It would be easier to sort through her father's stuff with Estelle at her side. She could not comprehend why her father had not fallen hopelessly in love with Estelle. The woman was graceful and attractive, with a kind, generous heart, but she'd learnt to accept the complexities of human nature that sometimes could not be understood, nor could they be explained. It had been a lot easier than Gemma had imagined to throw her father's stuff out, as Estelle had efficiently arrived at the apartment, armed with black bin liners and large cardboard boxes. It was an unassuming, nondescript old shoebox that would turn what had been a very productive day over on its head. "What's this?" she had asked Estelle, pulling out a dusty shoebox that she'd found clandestinely hidden in the far corner of her father's closet, that she very nearly overlooked had it not been for a scattering of sunlight through the opening of the windows of the bedroom that had lit up the far corner of the closet, just enough to captivate Gemma's attention, so that crouching down on hands and knees, she reached towards the back of the cupboard to slide out the box, her fingers becoming black with dust, and tickled by the silken fibres of a web that she could see had disturbed a spider that hurriedly scuttled away, not remotely amused to be so rudely disturbed.
"Oh, throw it away, will you, dear? It's quite revolting,"
said Estelle, waving her arm around in disgust, looking disapprovingly at the woe-begotten decaying shoebox.
"Honestly, your father, what was he like, collecting all this rubbish?"
The shoebox was falling apart in Gemma's hands. The cardboard had degraded so much. It was covered in silken spider webs, congealed by dust. Gemma peered inside the box curiously, at the yellowing age newspaper cuttings, jaundiced by time, and very nearly did what Estelle had urged her to do. But something stopped her in her tracks. It was Gemma's mother's name on one of the newspaper cuttings that immediately grabbed her attention.
"These newspaper articles are about my mother,"
she told Estelle in confoundment, brushing away the dust from the box and examining the pile of papers more closely. She had taken the newspaper articles over to the bed, where she sat down on the edge of her father's king-size bed to read them, her heart pounding against her chest like a freight train thundering through a dark tunnel. She had a profound sense that within this box she was uncovering a secret that had remained buried for a long time, and she was about to uncover this secret that maybe her father had deliberately concealed from her. But Gemma did not care. She couldn't walk away from these articles. She needed to read the contents that might shed light on some of the dark shadows from her past, where her questions had remained so ambiguously vague and as dormant as a redundant seedling that refused to burst into blossom. Estelle had put a kind, cautionary hand on her shoulder.
"I don't know what these articles are about, Gemma," she said warningly, "but I need to advise you that you cannot unsee what you're about to read. Your father clearly hid them in the back of the closet for a very good reason, my dear, and my guess is he didn't want you to see them. I say that to you, Gemma, because after my mother died, I chose to read a page or two of her diary, something I have always regretted doing. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I persuaded myself a little peek at a page or two wouldn't hurt, and it was a big, big mistake on my part. In her diary I learnt my mother had never loved my father, that she'd married him because she was pregnant with me. And in those days, let's just say an unmarried mother was frowned upon greatly, and so my mother was rushed into marrying my father, before she began to show. My father adored my mother, you know, but when I read that page in the diary, I was so devastated by my mother's resentment towards my father. She described how she felt trapped in a marriage because of me, and that hurt me greatly. I threw her diary into the incinerator at once, but I was never able to forget the way she described my father, the unkind words she used against him, and it cut me to the quick, it did. And you can't unsee what I saw, and I've always regretted that, and I don't want you making the same mistake that I made."
"Well, if you only read 1 or 2 pages of your mother's diary," said Gemma, "it meant you read a day of her thoughts, that's all. Those thoughts could have changed over the years. Maybe she didn't resent your father in the end, because you never read all her thoughts, and thoughts do change."
"And I'm sure they probably did, and you're right. But my point is, Gemma, I should never have looked into my mother's private thoughts. But don't you see? If your father hid those newspaper cuttings away from you, he had his good reasons. Your father didn't want you to know the details in those articles. It probably is all about the car crash your late mother was involved in. Surely you don't want to upset yourself with reading all that stuff. It's bound to be quite a setback if you do."
"Do you remember how my dad would say my late mother was inquisitive like a squirrel, Gemma asked Estelle, looking into her stepmother's blue eyes. Are squirrels even inquisitive? Asked Estelle, raising a brow. I suppose they are to a degree, but I think monkeys are much, much worse. I remember on a trip to Africa, me and your father discovered a whole lot of monkeys rifling through our stuff, and that is what I call inquisitive. Squirrels, I'm not so sure. Well, whether squirrels are inquisitive or not is not my point. The point is, Estelle, I've inherited that unfortunate nosy quality from my mother. My father found it to be incredibly annoying. He never liked to answer any of my questions, you see. He said I should have been a newspaper reporter because I want to know so much. I like to know all the details, the ins and outs. And he was right about that. I've always been like that, Estelle. And when it comes to my mother, her whole life is clouded in ambiguous mystery. My father never told me much about her, even though I hammered away at him tirelessly like a jackhammer drill. But it was no use. He was never forthcoming. This is my opportunity, Estelle, to learn something about the accident that my mother was involved in. Something that my father willfully kept from me. I think I'm entitled to know what happened to my mother, don't you? Well then, go ahead, Gemma. Who am I to stop you? You're going to read the articles even if I discourage you from doing so. But don't blame me if you're left feeling distressed and disheartened, said Estelle, eyeing me warily through her pale blue eyes that were puckering up in the corners into worry lines. Don't look so worried, Estelle. I can handle a few newspaper articles, I'm most sure. Well, if you're going to read the article, said Estelle, looking at Gemma, you better read it to me as well, because I don't want to be left in the dark. And Gemma did just that, as she lifted a newspaper article out of the box. Listen to this, Estelle. This is curious. This is the headline. Is there a curse on the Dogwood Road? It goes on to say, many have asked this quintessential question, for the Dogwood Road is an unassuming backcountry road in Montana and has been subject of much media speculation for many who have driven down that back road and reported strange idiosyncratic sightings over the years. Many have reported seeing the ghostly spectre of a female hitchhiker who was knocked over by a motorcyclist in the 1960s and died instantly on impact. It is believed she's wearing bell-bottom blue jeans and a floral button-down shirt with elegant butterfly sleeves. Many believe the ghostly woman does not know she's dead and is hitchhiking for a lift years and years after the event. No one knows who the mysterious ghostly woman is, but many have seen her apparition that is so lifelike she is mistaken as being a genuine hitchhiker. Many drivers have claimed to have lifted her over the years, describing her as shy and reluctant to enter their car. It is only later they find the woman vanishes along the journey. Strange lights have been seen on the road, and outer-worldly mists that have covered the road in a dense fog, and people have reported to seeing gargantuan-sized, ambiguous figures in that mist. Mrs. Anker Priory, a local resident to the small Montana town, says she's been on that road when an unexplained mist appeared out of nowhere. She spoke to our reporter, Miles Ferguson, on the matter, warning people to avoid that back scenic country road whenever possible. It was too terrible for words. I absolutely loathe that road. At the very least, they should change the name. There's something not right about that road. Every time I drive down it, I have an airy, uncomfortable feeling that I cannot explain. And others like myself have expressed similar, very foreboding feelings about the place. I know it's a scenically spectacular and idyllic route, which is why I always like to drive down that route. But never again. Never ever again. A catastrophic mistake, if you ask me. I hasten to say it was on a magnificently beautiful Monday evening in early summer. I decided to take that back route home. Oh, what a fool I was! I still regret that decision. I'd been meeting up with locals in town to discuss the school fete, and the meeting had gone on for far longer than intended. I decided I'd take that scenic drive, and it was a decision I will never stop regretting. As I was driving down the road, all of a sudden, a haunting thick white mist began to creep across the road.
and it was the airiest thing I have ever beheld. There are no words to describe how ominous and how evil it was. I was overcome with a bodeful feeling of absolute dread. Every hair on my body was standing up on end. I felt something was in that mist, and it was watching me. And whatever it was demoniacal. I had to stop my car in the middle of the road. I could not proceed any further. Doing so would have been treacherous, because I couldn't see anything ahead of me at all. All I could see was this thick, cloying white mist. The worst part of it all was I observed this Herculean dark silhouette in the mist, and it was staring at me. Those eyes burnt into me, but I have no idea what this thing was. But the whole experience was so outer-worldly, so dreadfully bizarre. The mist then began to slink away and dissipate, and I thankfully drove away from that road like a bat out of hell. The next day my car smelt of burnt rubber and a strange kind of tree resin I've smelt once before, but I'm not sure what it is. And I couldn't wash the smell out of the seats for an entire month. One thing is for sure, I will not be seen dead driving anywhere near that road again. And I would advise others, like myself, to heed my warning if they know what's good for them. The latest mystery that occurred on the old Dogwood Road has befuddled many. When two best friends, Victoria Fontaine and Samantha Barton, were travelling down that road in their car to visit a friend. According to Victoria Fontaine, a magnificent deer with the hugest antlers she'd ever seen, capable of doing a great deal of damage, spontaneously ran out into the road. The deer looked terribly afraid, as if it was being chased by something. Victoria Fontaine said she could see the abject terror in the creature's eyes. She tried to avoid hitting the magnificent deer, and her truck swerved, lost traction, and went violently smashing into a tree. She claims to have lost consciousness for a while, and was trapped in the car, which was badly crushed. But there was no sign of Samantha Barton. She disappeared from the car, and was never ever seen again. The mystery of the disappearance of local small-town girl Samantha Barton, known to her friends as Sammy, in the small unassuming town, has left many locals baffled as to what became of her. Local shopkeeper Spencer Van Dyke described Sammy Barton as a delightful young woman. "She's been helping me at my grocery store since she was a wee little girl. I can assure you, she'd never deliberately disappear like this. She loved the bones off that baby of hers, was delighted to finally become a mother. She told me her baby daughter Gemma was the delight of her entire life. She would never abandon a 1-year-old child like this. Samantha Barton was a responsible woman, you know, a hard worker, always very punctual. I cannot comprehend what could have happened to the poor woman. Some people believe she was abducted by aliens, or even by a stranger visiting our parts, who saw a quintessential opportunity to prey upon a beautiful young woman like Sammy. Others believe that her husband had something to do with her disappearance, but I disagree on that. While others say the Dogwood Road is like the Bermuda Triangle, where strange idiosyncratic things happen. And I don't disagree with that. I've travelled down that road myself, and there are things that happen on that road that cannot be explained, and I would rather not discuss the matter any further." Mr. Edward Barton, Samantha Barton's husband, was under investigation by the police, but they are satisfied he has nothing to do with the mysterious vanishing of his wife. So all that is left is the ashes of speculation. What did happen to Samantha Barton? Gemma looked up at Estelle in shock. "I can't believe my dad lied to me, Estelle. He told me my mother died in a car crash. It wasn't true. My mother disappeared off the face of the earth. What if she's still alive? She could be out there somewhere, Estelle." Estelle took Gemma in her arms and began to rock her gently. "Did I not say, Gemma, that sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves is not to know? You've read the article, and now look how upset you are. I knew this would happen. And I seriously doubt your mother is alive. If she was, I think we'd know about it by now, unless she deliberately absconded from the face of the earth. But from what your father told me, and what the newspaper article says, your mother was a very responsible woman, and she loved the bones of you. She'd have never deserted you. So something happened to her. Of that I am most sure. But why did my dad lie to me? Why didn't he tell me she disappeared? He didn't lie to you, dear. That's being a bit extreme, and you're being unfair to your father there. Your mother was involved in a car accident in the 1980s, was she not? With her best friend, Victoria Fontaine. That much we know is absolutely true. By all accounts, the authorities have assumed your mother must be dead. When someone disappears after a long period of time, most people assume that they are dead. That is the natural conclusion to make. Maybe your beloved father wanted to spare you the lack of closure he probably felt in his own life. Do you know, not knowing what happened to a beloved pet or person that you care about passionately can eat away at you indiscriminately? It is so crushing. Believe me, I know all about it. I once owned a spectacular green and red parrot called Gustus. He flew away, and I never know what became of him. I lost so much sleep over that beautiful bird for many years. It's the not knowing that's the killer. It may be the very reason why your father never opened his heart up to me. Perhaps he never had any closure from his relationship with your mother. That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, if you have no closure in your life, how can you move forward? Think about it. It explained why the burial site he booked with a tombstone for your mother never contained her bones. You used to visit that grave regularly, don't you remember, when you were a little girl, to lay down pretty flowers for your mother's grave? You'd talk to her, believing her bones were under the ground, but she was never there. But that was still a nice thing for you to do, to be able to visit the grave, was it not? Of course it was good, but her remains were never there. Why would my dad do that to me? It's treacherous, Estelle. I think I can understand where he's coming from, said Estelle. Your father wanted you to have a point of contact by erecting that memorial stone. He probably did it for you as he did it for himself, I'm most sure. Sometimes when someone dies and the body is never recovered, people erect a memorial stone, don't they? It's a very nice thing to do. He probably booked the plot so that if your mother's remains were one day recovered, she could be buried with him. I just wish my dad had been honest with me, Estelle. Was that too much to ask of him? I keep telling you, Gemma. Your father wanted to protect you, Gemma, so don't be too hard on him. It meant you could go to bed at night as a young girl knowing your mother was dead, not wondering if she was still alive. Where is the closure in that for you? The mysterious disappearance of your mother must have eaten away at your poor father. Can you imagine what that must have been like for him, not knowing what had ever happened to his wife? And likely it would have eaten away at you too. He wanted to spare you from all of that. Look at you now. Now that you know the truth, you are becoming completely restless. It was a bad thing that you read the article. It really was. I warned you about it. You look as flustered as a pigeon that has run into the family tabby. It's not healthy for you to be discomposed like this, Gemma. I think you should let it all go, I really do. Move on with your life. Sometimes in life answers will never be forthcoming. Some things you will never know the answers to. I've had to accept it, that I'll never know what happened to my parrot. I think you should do the same when it comes to your mother. Sometimes the best thing we can do is to let it go. I'm sorry, Estelle. I know you've got my best interests at heart, and I'm grateful for that. Really, I am. But I need answers. I must find them. Knowing about my mother a little more and what happened to her that night that she disappeared will bring me the closure I seek if I find answers. I have to go to that small town in Montana where my mother grew up as a girl, and I'm going to find this Victoria Fontaine. I'm going to speak to her personally. And to anyone who has any memories of my mother, I'm going to find that old Dogwood Road. Why am I not surprised, Gemma? You never surprise me. You are so burning with curiosity. And I don't know if you know the old saying, but curiosity killed the cat. I despair with you. I really do. Because I can't convince you to change your mind. I'm not even going to try and persuade you to change your mind, because what is the point? I know you're like a dog with a bone when you've got your mind set on something. And so I'm not going to interfere. But what I will say to you, Gemma, is be careful. People in small towns can be incredibly cliquey, you know. They might not take too kindly to your coming along, poking your nose into other people's business and asking all kinds of questions about an old case that happened a long time ago. But Samantha Barton was my mother. Don't I have a right to find out what happened to her? Of course you have a right to find out, dear. But missing persons cases can be incredibly distressing, because very often answers are never found. But I know you're going to do what you want to do, and so who am I to change your mind? But as I keep warning you, don't blame me if it's a total train smash.
Gemma did not heed her stepmother's warnings. She loved Estelle very much, but felt that her stepmother could be a tad overdramatic at times. She had left New York in a tearing hurry, almost as if the city was suffocating the very life out of her. Indeed, it really had felt as if she was drowning, so getting out of New York would feel like being rescued from a sinking ship that she desperately needed to escape, after she'd come to the stark, horrifying realization that the life she'd enjoyed in Manhattan with her father had not been as authentic as she'd first believed. But right now, all she wanted to do was to focus on chasing answers to enigmatic questions that had arrived in her life like unwanted baggage that she did not want to open up, but needed to in order to find her peace. The taxi driver, after picking her up from the airport, had dropped her off at a little cabin in the woods that she had found after an extensive search online, which she had booked at once. Gemma had no idea how long she would stay in the small Montana town, but at least the money her father had left her would tide her over for the time being, for the very next year if need be, before she chose to return to her life in New York. And her boss had kindly assured her that her job would remain open-ended for as long as possible. She could return whenever she chose. She observed on the website a rather run-down, crude-looking cabin that appeared to have been well kitted out for holiday-makers and was affordable to rent. Gemma had not hesitated to book the place at once. She was an impulsive person by nature, that took the bull by the horns and dived into life without apology, sometimes taking unnecessary risks along the way. As a teenager, she'd been picked up by dubious characters hitchhiking across America, the kind of people that made you think you might just be taking a lift with a serial killer. And at one time she'd gone camping with a friend on an old Indian burial ground, which had scared the bejesus out of her, when the tent she and her friend were staying in began to be whipped around by a heavy windstorm, when there was no wind outside the tent. So seeing the tent rattling around without any wind was grievously unsettling. Worse still, they'd heard strange chanting sounds and flute music, and had been so freaked out they had abandoned their tent in the middle of the night, certain that their tent was surrounded by unseen nefarious entities. They could feel they were being circled by a group of indignantly angry, crazed spirits. In truth, they had physically seen nothing at all, but the incensed, diabolical, manic energy had been palpable, and it had made itself clear to the two girls that they needed to leave at once, and they knew that if they did not, something quite dreadful would have become of them. In the beginning, Gemma had never been remotely interested in the paranormal, but after that absurd experience camping on an Indian burial ground with a friend, she had realized that there is more to this world than meets the eye. For Gemma's haunting experience like this, it had opened her eyes and shaken her out of her paradigm that she had formed in her head of the world, based on what she'd been taught at school and university, because at such a young, tender age you're malleable and are like putty in the hands of your superiors. It's easy to have your opinion shaped by the people that inadvertently cross your path and influence your life. But Gemma's mind was now wide open to brand new ideas and possibilities, and her mother's disappearance had left her pondering to what could have become of her. She knew her father would never have harmed her mother, nor would her mother have willingly abandoned her when she was only a 1-year-old baby. She wondered whether her mother had been abducted against her will. In her eyes it seemed like the most plausible explanation, based on some of her ominous experiences with hitchhikers in the past. It would be very easy for someone to have kidnapped her mother at the scene of an accident, and for her never to be seen ever again. The taxi driver that had picked her up from the airport had been a thin, wiry man, with a beanpole-like physique, with wild, untamed hair that reminded her of a mad poet, with inquisitive, dark, ferret eyes that studied her with a keen interest. The taxi smelt of cigarette smoke and tuna fish sandwiches, and there were unfortunate holes in the upholstering, where some of the stuffing was showing and beginning to pop out of the seats like pieces of popcorn. The cab itself looked as if it was outdated, but that didn't seem to matter at all around here, as lots of old things were put to good use in the small town. They probably embraced the age-old adage that if it's not broken it doesn't need fixing, whereas in New York it was always getting rid of the old to embrace the new. The good thing about this taxi driver was he never said a word. For some that might have been unsettling, but for Gemma it was a welcome relief. For one who loved to ask questions, she certainly hated it when questions were directed at her, and would do her damnedest to avoid questions of every kind. It was not that Gemma had anything to hide, but she didn't like anything known about her private life. For these reasons alone she abandoned all social media platforms, as frankly she didn't want people to know where she went to dinner last Thursday night, no matter how fabulous it was, or about the spectacular holiday she'd enjoyed in the Maldives. "It's very good to be anonymous," her father would always tell her. But that salient advice had come from one of the most private men that Gemma had ever known, who liked to remain ex-directory in every single regard. "You don't want people knowing all about your personal life. It's an invasion of your privacy," he would tell Gemma. And Gemma had believed her father was absolutely right. If she had any online profiles, people could find out everything about her in a heartbeat, and that was exceedingly unsettling, especially if unscrupulous, nefarious people had access to her private information, which could eventually be used against her. She was in no doubt the taxi driver was asking all kinds of questions about her in his head, but his tongue was firmly tied. It was clear he was not a forthcoming person, someone introverted who, much like herself, did not expose his life to social media platforms. But it didn't stop him from being naturally curious by nature, or even remotely adverse to reading other people's online profiles, as long as they were not his own. Gemma certainly couldn't judge him for that, as Gemma's middle name was Curiosity, which was why she had come to Montana in the first place. In this part of the world she didn't doubt that the youngsters living here often left their home to go to universities, in big university towns like Boston, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Berkeley, California, or Charlottesville in Virginia. Some may never return again to their rural lives, which Gemma thought was desperately sad. When the taxi driver thought Gemma wasn't looking, he regarded her through the visor mirror with a keen, inquisitive interest. There was no doubt he was wondering why a New York girl had come to such a remote part of the world that wasn't exactly a tourist haven. As what could a city girl have in common with not a very current, rather unfashionable Montana town, where hip was not actually a word that would describe the location he loved to call home, but spectacularly beautiful, most certainly. But he did not articulate any questions to Gemma, and likewise she did not volunteer any information, so the entire journey was steeped in a rather congenial silence, apart from the sound of the car juddering and jolting rather awkwardly down the long earthen roads. The taxi driver occasionally slurped some milkshake he was drinking, slurping it up through a plastic straw. Of course people came to this part of the world to visit Yellowstone National Park, but let's just say this little rural town was usually overlooked by holidaymakers who were more than lightly shunned by the locals here, and not made to feel terribly welcome. It was likely these tourists were looking for more exciting places to pick up curios and trinkets to take back home. Gemma had almost jumped out of her skin when the taxi driver had said, "We're nearly there." The man could actually speak. Before long the taxi driver took a quick turn through a narrow pathway in the trees, and then got out of his taxi to open a rather rusty-looking cattle gate that squeaked in protest as it swung open, while the thin taxi driver scampered back to his car, revved up the engine and shot through the trees like a bullet, until he finally parked outside a wooden cabin that looked even more downtrodden in real life than on the website, but the place would be suitable for Gemma. I mean, she hadn't come here to live in the lap of luxury, and if she was going to rough it for a while, that would be no skin off her nose. It would be part of the exciting adventure of coming to this unspoilt part of the world, where you were surrounded by the magnanimous arms of the rugged, natural world. It was a far cry from her more pampered, rather pooch life in New York, where the conveniences of modern life were on your front doorstep, or only a few blocks away, where you could almost access everything you could possibly need. Gemma climbed out of the taxi with a vacillating hesitancy, and hauled her oversized suitcase out of the back of the trunk. With the help of the scrawny taxi driver, who, although willowy and slight, seemed to be surprisingly strong, like an ox, Gemma paid the driver for the fare, deciding to give him a generous tip for his kindness. If he was grateful, he did not show it on his face, but simply nodded stoically at her, and she watched him nimbly move to his taxi, and his car shot again through the trees like a rocket, a stunt he would never have pulled off in New York, without guaranteeing an unfortunate collision, with calamitous consequences, no doubt. Once the taxi driver had gone, Gemma was now completely alone, surrounded by the tranquilizing sounds of the trees swishing their branches in a cool breeze, and the pretty beguiling trills of the birds basking high up in the branches. She could hear some of them rustling high up in the trees and darting from one branch to another. She could not help privately wondering how spectacular the prepossessing views must be of the countryside, for the birds high up in those towering trees, where you could probably see everything for miles around. Gemma had to admit it, the woods that surrounded the cabin were pretty as a picture, and made some of the whimsical fairy stories her father had told her as a little girl come alive. She brushed back a couple of stray unwanted tears that had trickled down her cheeks like a couple of lonely raindrops on a glass pane. Where had they come from? She couldn't help but wonder what her father would think of her visit to her mother's hometown, on her intrepid search for answers. She had a sense he would not be terribly thrilled with her, but that was too bad. She needed to come here. Every time she thought about her father, the tears would spring into life, as if she turned on a faucet at the kitchen sink. The woodgrove boasted a fabulous, higgledy-piggledy, eclectic mix of spindly trees, and some that were significantly more substantial in size, fiercely fighting against each other to compete for light. They were tall, statuesque, lofty, and covered in a plethora of exquisite leaves, and their rambling foliage was pleasing to the eye. Gemma trudged over to the cabin and stood over the threadbare mat. She found the cold cast-iron key lying buried beneath the bottom of her shoulder bag, which had been sent to her in the post after she'd booked the cabin. She plunged the key into the lock with a spirited expectancy. In the beginning the key refused to turn, and Gemma found herself silently swearing in frustration under her breath. But finally, with one frantic twist of the key, along with a hard push, the door jerked open with a noisy creak. The cabin was small, but perfect for all her intrinsic needs. The bedroom, living room, and kitchen and bathroom seemed to fold into each other seamlessly, into an open-plan arrangement that lightly kept the cabin sumptuously warm in winter. It was basic, but suitable for all her needs, with a wood-burning stove, a gas-fired oven, refrigerator, and hot water system, along with some oil-fired lanterns. There were bookshelves bursting with books of every kind, and a very comfortable queen-size bed, covered with crisp, clean sheets, along with a few mismatched pieces of furniture that added to the coziness of the cabin. The wooden floors were polished to perfection, but exceptionally old, as they creaked when you walked on their surfaces, but they were covered in attractive-looking Navajo woven rugs. Gemma was terribly pleased to see that the owner had ordered the food she requested, so her kitchen was well stocked, and her refrigerator contained eggs, bacon, hot dogs, cheese, salad, and pickles. Gemma threw her suitcase onto the edge of the bed, when she heard a voice calling out to her. "Hello! Hello there! Is anybody home? Anyone home?" Gemma realised it must be the owner of the cabin, so she scurried over to the front door. An old woman was standing in the doorway wearing a bright turquoise dress and a large straw floppy hat that covered a rather crepey skin, covered with a plethora of lines. The woman had the palest blue eyes that Gemma had ever beheld, and the bright turquoise colour she was wearing made her eyes appear all the more insipid and pale. "Hello, dear," said the woman. "You must be Gemma Barton. My name is Eleanor Tansey. It's so good to meet you. I hope you did have a good trip from New York. This must be a bit of a culture shock for you out here. We're not desperately sophisticated in these parts, I'm afraid. But some people say that that is part of our charm. I like to think they're right about that. It's another world out here, I'm afraid. Very different to New York." "I'd say they were right about that," said Gemma. "Do you know what? Sophistication can be overrated sometimes. My dad always told me the simple things in life are what matters. He always said when you enter this world you come with nothing, and when you leave you go with nothing. He said we complicated our lives with so much stuff. So there is something liberating being out here in the natural world, not weighed down by the cares of a high-tech competitive society. But I dare say coming from a noisy city is going to take quite an adjustment for me." "Well, I'm so glad to hear you say that, young lady. Sounds like your father is a wise soul." "Was wise," Gemma corrected. "He died a couple of months back, I'm afraid." The woman pulled a sympathetic face. "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss, my dear. Losing a father is never easy. I was very close to my father, so when he died I felt as if I'd been run over by a bus. I was completely devastated. I was very close to my father. But I promise you, it does get easier with time. It is true, time is a healer. But the one thing is you just don't ever forget. That's what never changes. But you are right. You will take a while adjusting to the sounds out here of the countryside. Very different to the city it is. I do worry when people like yourself come to our part of the world from the big city. It concerns me that city types might get desperately bored out here, especially as we don't have Wi-Fi's facilities. At the cabin our lives are pretty simple and basic, you know. But then most guests going to Yellowstone National Park don't stop through our town. We're probably far too quaint and unsophisticated for them. Not nearly exciting enough, I'm afraid." "I like quaint," said Gemma. "It's intriguing." "I hope you're happy, dear, in our rather rudimentary cabin. It's a very lovely cabin, though. Very cosy. And I hope you're satisfied with the shopping I picked up for you, dear. I do sometimes concern myself about the brands that people like to enjoy. I worry that I get it horribly wrong. It's not easy shopping for strangers, you know. One guest I had staying at the cabin made such a dreadful fuss about the peanut butter I bought him. It turned out he liked crunchy peanut butter, and was appalled by the smooth version." "I'm very impressed," said Gemma. "You've excelled yourself. And I'm sorry if someone made a fuss about peanut butter. If they weren't happy with your choice, they could get off their backsides and buy the correct brand themselves. You did your best to accommodate them. As my father used to say, you can't please all the people all of the time. There's always going to be someone that's disappointed." "Your father really was a wizened soul, wasn't he?" said the woman, looking pleased. "You sound exactly like my husband, you know. You're quite a feisty one, aren't you? With strong opinions. And I like people who wear their heart on their sleeves. You'd like my husband very much, you know. He said much the same about the peanut butter incident. Oh, on another note, before I forget, I'm sure you noticed the old station wagon parked next to the cabin. It used to belong to my husband. It's filled with petrol.
It's available for our guests to use at the cabin for an extra fee, so that they're not completely cut off. They can go to the local town and stuff like that. But word of advice, dear, I don't want to alarm you or scare you, but you are a city girl, and you're not used to country life at all. And all the sounds out here can be very foreboding, you know. If I were you, I'd lock myself away safely in the cabin. Don't be tempted to go out. It's not a good idea.
Why? Asked Gemma. Eleanor Tansey shrugged uncertainly, as if she wasn't sure whether she thought that Gemma would believe what she had to say next or not.
I know people that come from the city think of us folk that live in the country as simpletons. But, you know, strange things happen in those woods. Very strange things. And it's not because we're superstitious, as many townsfolk believe we are, well, city folk. But the truth is, strange things rarely do happen here during the witching hour. That's when the activity steps up a notch or two. I've walked through those trees in the middle of the night myself, and let me tell you that I can feel that something is distinctly off. I don't mean to scare you or frighten you, my dear. That is absolutely not my intention. But I do like to advise and warn all my guests to stay in their cabins at night, and not to be tempted to go out and investigate any strange noises you might hear. If you walk through those trees for some way, there's a back country road most people like to avoid. Well, especially at night, she said, pointing through the trees. It's got a haunted reputation, I'm afraid. People claim to have picked up a female hitchhiker on that road. I know it's true because my husband picked her up once. Quite a fright he had, let me assure you.
He did? Gemma asked, her eyes growing round with shock. She cupped her mouth in astonishment.
You don't believe me, dear, do you? Said the woman, chuckling, pulling out a handkerchief from her pocket and dabbing her forehead to wipe away beads of perspiration. Dear me, what you must think, me sweating like a pig here. I know it might be hard to get your head around such things, but I assure you I'm not making any of this stuff up. Nor am I superstitious, by any manner of means. It is what it is, I'm afraid.
I 100% believe you, said Gemma.
You do? Asked the woman, looking surprised. You're different to most city folk. You most certainly are. When I mention these things to other folk, they laugh at me, as if they think I'm a silly old bat. But it doesn't bother me in the slightest. People are entitled to their opinions.
I might have done the same as them, said Gemma, looking shamefaced. But I camped on a tent once over an Indian burial ground, and never, ever again. I've never been more petrified in my entire life. The spirits surrounded our tent and began to chant, and although we couldn't see them, we could feel them. They made it so clear they wanted us gone. We abandoned everything and fled. So yes, I know about these things, and I know they're real. You have to experience them to believe them. What did your husband tell you about that ghostly hitchhiker? I've heard about her before in an old newspaper article I read. The road through the trees, it isn't called the Dogwood Road, is it? Asked Gemma, unable to believe she'd booked a cabin, a hair's breadth away from where her mother had disappeared. Could it be that her coming here was almost divinely orchestrated? Had her father not told her once that there was no such thing as coincidence? She could literally walk through the trees and she would be on a road where over 35 years ago her mother had vanished into thin air, like a wisp of smoke, never to be seen or heard from again. The woman looked visibly surprised. You know what? I do believe that was the old name for the road. But a local insisted on getting the name changed. I think she emphatically believed by changing the name of the road that the energy would be changed. But I don't think it worked at all. People believe the road is cursed. Bad things have happened on that road. And yes, my husband did indeed pick up a hitchhiker. He told me he couldn't understand what a young woman was doing on a road in the middle of the night, hitchhiking for a lift. He was grievously concerned for her safety, especially with it being inauspiciously dark and incredibly cold on that night. Stranger still, the woman wasn't dressed warmly enough.
It was bitterly cold, it really was. She didn't even own a coat. My husband had the interior heating on his car at full blast. He stopped his car on that road and told the woman to get in at once. He was determined he'd take her wherever she needed to go, even if it was out of his way. He wanted to ensure the young lady was safe. Otherwise, he'd be wrestling with his conscience. My husband is a very good man, you see. He said at first the young girl seemed rather hesitant to get into his truck, as if she was trying to discern whether she could trust him or not, which he thought was a very good sign. At least the girl would not accept a lift with just anyone, and still had her wits about her. She climbed into the truck and sat next to my husband, and he said the truck became terribly cold, icy cold. He thought it was because he'd opened the truck to let the cold air in when the woman sat down. He asked the young lady where she wanted to go, and she said to Old Maggie's, which was the name of an old boarding house that was open in the 60s to hitchhikers who were looking for a room. Old Maggie was a woman in her 70s, you see. She ran the place for many years, but it has long since been closed since the woman died. My husband was driving along and was about to tell her that Old Maggie's no longer existed, but he could recommend another reasonable bed and breakfast. Even this late at night, they'd be welcome to receive her. He turned around to find the hitchhiker had gone, vanished into thin air like a puff of smoke. He was very spooked. Gemma crinkled up her face, placing her hand on her chest. That has got to be freaky, really freaky. I think I'd die of a heart attack on the spot. You are telling me? My poor husband hightailed it back home as fast as he could. Frantic he was. Let me tell you, he refuses to drive on that backcountry road at night. During the day it's another matter, but at night, never. You should have seen him. White as a sheet he was. He said to me, "Eleanor Tansey, I think I've just picked up a ghost." That whole event, let me tell you, threw him off his pedestal. My husband's always sceptical of the paranormal. Well, he was back in those days. Not any more, let me tell you.
Did you hear about the case that happened in the 1980s? A woman disappearing from a car in an accident. I think the driver was trying to avoid a deer, and the car went colliding into a tree, and one of the people in the car, a woman called Samantha Barton, vanished from the car and was never ever seen again. Gemma asked the woman. The old woman raised a brow.
Do you know what? I think I remember hearing a story like that somewhere. But believe me, a plethora of very strange idiosyncratic things have happened on that road over the years. Nothing would surprise me at all. But me and my husband only moved here 10 years ago, so we don't know all the stories concerning that back road. And we don't want to either. Personally, there are some things best not knowing, because I, for one, would like to sleep at night. If you walk through these lofty trees and follow the Croydon Trail, it's marked the Croydon Path. It leads directly to our house, which is substantial in size. You can't miss it. It's a double-story red-bricked farmhouse. It's far too big for the likes of my husband and I. But we want to avoid using the upper story, as climbing that staircase for the old legs is something I'd rather avoid. But when the grandkids come to stay with us, they take over the upper floor with my 2 children, and they love it. They live in Houston, you see, and they come here to spend Christmas with us every year, and they have a whale of a time down here. The original property on this land was owned by the Croydons, hence the name of the trail that leads directly to our house. If you need anything, you know where to come. My husband keeps bees, so if you need to buy any honey, he will be delighted to sell you some. We sell our honey in town and to other parts of Montana, and across America as well. My husband is passionate about his beekeeping. It's incredible to think that everything in the hive centers around a queen bee. On one occasion we had to order another queen bee for his hive online, and the bee arrived promptly in the post. My husband had to hope the bees would accept her, and thankfully they did. It's incredible what you can order online these days, is it not?
It sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm intrigued.
said Gemma. "Going back to the old Dogwood Road, do you know of a woman called Victoria Fontaine by any chance? She, I believe, was involved in that accident with Samantha Barton that occurred in the 1980s. She'd be in her 50s now, I suspect. I think she might live around here, unless, of course, she left town a long time ago, which is a distinct possibility," said Gemma, hoping with all her heart that she'd be able to trace the whereabouts of Victoria Fontaine, for this was the one person who might be able to give her an insight into what really happened to her mother all those years ago. "Victoria Fontaine," said Eleanor reflectively. "How very strange. I do know a Violet Fontaine, not a Victoria. I mean, I've heard of a Violet Fontaine. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same person you could be talking about. It could be, I suppose. She's a very odd person, you know. Keeps herself to herself, quite reclusive, but definitely in her 50s, I would imagine. She lives on the edge of town in the old house with the crooked chimney and the white wicker fence, with all the wind chimes dangling in the old willow tree at the very front of the cottage. I think the cottage is called Windy Willows, which is apt given all the wind chimes on that tree. They make quite the commotion, I'm told, when the weather is incredibly windy." "I can imagine," said Gemma. "Well, I will love you and leave you, dear. I've got an awful lot of stuff to do, but it has been a pleasure to meet you, and I mean that, genuinely I do. If you need anything, you can walk straight back to my house and just shout out or knock on the door. You can even walk straight in if you go around the back to the kitchen." Gemma watched Eleanor Tansey scuttling away, a bright figure in turquoise, disappearing through the trees, following the Croydon path back to the property. Gemma knew that her next port of call would be visiting Violet Fontaine the following morning. She privately wondered if Violet might be the sister of Victoria Fontaine. Maybe Victoria had left the small town a long time ago, but there was a distinct possibility that Violet might be Victoria, and she could only hope and pray that this was actually the case. In the morning she hoped she'd find some answers to a plethora of questions that consumed her every waking thought since her father's passing. The next morning she woke up much later than usual. In New York she was up and about with the birds, but for the first time in a very long time she had thoroughly enjoyed a good night's sleep. She was certain that the country air, with its rich supply of fresh oxygen, had helped her to sleep like a log, which invariably happened when her head hit the pillow. And there was one thing she could say about Eleanor Tansey. She had fitted the cabin with the most sumptuously comfortable bed that Gemma had ever slept on in her entire life. She made a mental note that when she returned to New York, she'd be investing in a brand new bed, one exactly the same as Eleanor Tansey had in the cabin. It would seem the combination of the cosy bed and the rich, fresh country air were the quintessential perfect ingredients to enjoy a good night's sleep. For a moment, when she woke up in the dark cabin, with its block-out curtains tightly drawn, she had wondered where on earth she was, and had felt momentarily disorientated and rather confused, until she pulled back the curtains to invite in the soft prisms of sunlight into the room, and then she knew exactly why she was here. She had stared out at the bedazzling pretty views onto an abundance of lofty trees that swaddled the cabin on every side. She glanced briefly at her bedside clock on the nightstand that she had brought along with her, and was stunned to see it was 10:30 in the morning. She couldn't believe it was this late. She needed to get a move on, as the city girl within her was used to being in a perpetual rush. She wasn't used to slowing down. She, of course, was tempted to languidly laze around all day and wallow luxuriantly in the cabin, as it was so sumptuously cosy, but a hunger for answers fueled her ever-increasing need to get moving that morning, and she left the cabin without even enjoying her usual morning cup of coffee. The cranky old station wagon appeared to be very cantankerous and quite uncooperative that morning, but after she managed to warm up the engine, it breezed along merrily down the country road without a care in the world, until she finally reached the outskirts of the small town. It didn't take her terribly long to spot the cottage with the crooked chimney and the weeping willow cascading over the white wicker fence.
covered in wind chimes. Gemma parked her car on the side of the road next to the cottage and trudged down a stone pathway to the door of the cottage, greeted to the tinkling sounds of the wind chimes swinging away merrily in the breeze to their heart's content. It was a pleasantly warm day, and soft sunshine dappled the small whimsical whitewashed cottage in ethereal shadows that danced around the walls in prisms of rainbow light that you so often see in a disco ball. It gave the cottage an enchanting quality. Gemma observed net curtains were drawn in every window, as if the owner was hell-bent on blocking out the world, along with any snooping, prying eyes. Someone appeared to be twitching the curtains as she neared her approach, so she knew she had been seen. She was greeted to still more wind chimes, many homemade and rather charming, from dangling shells to little taxidermist birds swinging on strings backwards and forwards, along with a screen door that was only slightly ajar. She wondered what she would do, as she could not knock on a screen door, could she? So she chose to call out instead. "Hello! Hello, is anybody there? Hello!" She could hear a strange rustling sound coming from inside the cottage, along with the reluctant, begrudging sound of naked feet padding to the door. She was greeted to the sour expression of a woman whose 50-year-old mottled grey complexion had not been kind to her. The woman looked considerably older than her 50 years, as if she'd been left out in the sun for too long and become faded, weathered and worn, like a dried-out old prune. She eyed Gemma suspiciously through her pale blue eyes. Her long grey hair hung around her face in a messy ribbon of unglamorous tangled beaded braids that suggested that her hair probably had not been honoured by a hairbrush in the last decade or so, and would likely be a nightmare to brush. She had likely not visited a hair salon for over 30 years or more. But despite this, the woman was squeaky clean and smelt strongly of a smoky, rather pleasant soap that hinted of rose and jasmine notes. The woman was wearing a modest dress, similar to what the Amish would wear, only it was covered in pretty flowers and spun around her like a loose tent, as if she wanted to be as carefree as the wind chimes hanging outside her front door. Gemma noticed her bare feet were perfectly manicured and painted in a rather dashing green nail polish. "Who are you?" snapped the woman. The cranky, capricious woman did not fail to hide the level of annoyance creeping over her face. "What do you want with me? I don't appreciate strangers snooping around my property like this." The abrupt tone of her voice was fiercely indignant. She clearly did not appreciate being disturbed. Gemma could see she lived a very solitary, sequestered, private existence, as if she had deliberately chosen to vanquish the world from her life, and had wantedly retracted from all social interaction, like a tortoise slipping away clandestinely into its shell, where it wanted to stay snugly cocooned in the safety of its secret inner world, where it hoped to remain undisturbed. It was likely this eccentric woman had chosen to isolate herself from the people in town. "I'm looking for Victoria Fontaine," said Gemma. "I heard your name is Violet. Is Victoria your sister? Do you know where I can possibly find her? I need to speak to her urgently about a private matter that is terribly important to me." "Who are you?" the woman repeated brusquely, snapping at Gemma like a turtle. For a moment Gemma said nothing. "Has the cat got your tongue, girl? I asked you a question. Who are you? And what are you doing on my property?" asked the woman, looking fiercely guarded. "If you're selling something, will you bog off? I'm not remotely interested in what you have to sell. Just leave me alone." "I'm not selling anything, ma'am. I'm actually from New York. My name is Gemma. I'm interested in a car accident that occurred on the old Dogwood Road in the 1980s, involving a missing persons case that has never been solved." The woman snapped again, her tone becoming distinctly sharper and almost aggressive. "Would you kindly leave my property? I don't want reporters sniffing around like a bad smell. I've got nothing to say in regards to the matter. Nothing, you hear me? Especially over a case that happened many moons ago. Haven't you got anything better to do with your time, young lady, than disturb the likes of me? Isn't there other interesting things going on in the world?
I don't welcome strangers on my property. Never have and never will. If you want to hear what I've got to say in regards to the matter, no comment. You hear that, young lady? No comment. Watch my lips. No comment. All that happened a long time ago. It's ancient history. Water under the bridge. Move along now, will you? And stop poking your nose into the past. Go back to New York, will you? Leave me alone. Now would you get the hell off my property and bog off back to the place that regurgitated you? I told reporters everything I had to say all those years ago, and I'm not about to be interrogated all over again.
The woman then banged the screen door behind her so furiously hard that the whole cottage wobbled in the aftermath of the shock. She disappeared back into her cottage, mumbling very angrily under her breath. Gemma had not expected such an uncongenial welcome like this, but she hadn't come all the way to a small Montana town to be fobbed off like this. Her father's words echoed in her head. If at first you don't succeed, you try again. That had been her father's motto in life. When Gemma was about to give up on something, she attended a pottery class once and was about to give up as every blob of clay she threw onto the wheel just came apart like sludge in her hands. I don't want to go back, she had told her father. I'm so useless with pottery. Gemma, you're going back and you're trying again. You hear me? Don't you dare give up, her father had spouted, and he'd been absolutely right, for she had produced some outstanding masterpieces in her class. So giving up was not a good idea. Gemma knew if anyone would shed light on what had happened to her mother all those years ago, it was likely this woman. And in Gemma's opinion, the woman's obvious reluctance to talk meant she was likely hiding something. Gemma opened the screen door a crack to call through the cottage again. Please, Mrs. Fontaine, I need to speak to you about Samantha Barton. She disappeared in the 1980s in a car accident that either you or a family member of yours called Victoria Fontaine was involved in. I know only you can help me get some closure in this case. I'm Samantha Barton's daughter, Gemma Barton. I'm not a reporter. I just want to know what really happened to my mother all those years ago. I'm not sniffing around to annoy you, I promise you that. I just need closure, that's all. The woman reluctantly came over to the swing door, where Gemma was standing, and swung it open. You better come in, then, hadn't you? She said. Gemma followed the woman rather gingerly into the living room, that smelt a little damp and musty, but it was clean enough, although the furniture looked as if it was stuck between a 1970s and 80s time warp, and the upholstery on some of the furnishings was so old it appeared to be faded and threadbare, so much so you couldn't even make out the original design of the fabric. But at one time, some of those furnishings might have been quite expensive, although most of the furniture did look like it had been purchased from a junkyard sale. You better take a seat and make yourself comfortable, said the woman rather begrudgingly, pointing over to a wing chair covered in a colourful crochet blanket. Would you like anything to drink while we're at it? Coffee would be great, said Gemma, secretly thinking that some caffeine in her system would brighten the ominous start to the day, as greeting Miss Fontaine at her doorstep had been like being rudely thrust into the eye of a capriciously belligerent storm, without any prior warning at all. For a moment Gemma had a fleeting respect for newspaper reporters, as dealing with women as prickly and cantankerous as Miss Fontaine could not be easy. How did you ever get information out of women like this, who was as hardened as a coconut? Jem had thought her father was a closed book growing up, but this woman, she broke the mould. She was like one of those oyster shells that would not open up without a hard yank. Miss Fontaine frowned. I don't do coffee, but I do have ginger tea. Is that all right? That sounds great, said Gemma politely. You stay there, said the woman, raising an old, very wrinkled-looking hand, like a lollipop lady at a pedestrian crossing, as if warning Gemma not to follow her into the kitchen. Gemma had no intention of doing so. Make yourself comfortable, as I said the woman, pointing again to the wing chair, that at one time would have been an eye-catching feature, but it was as bedraggled and lost as everything else in the room. "I won't be a tick," she said, scuttling away with the purposeful intent of a dung beetle. If there were any small mercies for Gemma, at the very least Miss Fontaine's abrasive, rather thorny tone towards her had dissipated significantly. But still, the woman appeared unduly guarded, as if she was not altogether comfortable having Gemma in her little cottage, and was more than a little adverse to entertaining strangers at any time. So that Gemma was a little like that annoying grit that gets into an oyster shell, that eventually becomes a lustrous pearl. Gemma's keen eye surveyed her surroundings with a hawk-like interest. She got up steadily from the wing chair from which she was seated, as her narrowing eyes were drawn to a large framed photograph, standing in the middle of the mantel above the fireplace. There was a wrought-iron wood-burning stove, pride of place, at the focal point of the room, although on this warm morning the stove, although fully stacked with wood, was certainly not on. Gemma noticed a large accented wooden beam sweeping across the centre of the white ceiling, where bunches of upside-down herbs were drying, like lavender and thyme. Gemma drew in a sharp breath and walked over cautiously to the picture on the mantel, as if some unknown powerful force was dragging her to the picture against her control, as her curiosity was whipped up within her like an unbridled ocean current. She recognized the girl in the photograph to be her mother, standing next to another young lady that Gemma suspected must be Victoria Fontaine. She studied the photograph closely, lifting up the frame in her trembling fingers. For a moment she wanted more than anything else in the world to enter that photograph and to become one with it, to be standing next to those two girls in the picture, breathing in the very same fresh air that they were enjoying. Gemma's heart winced in pain, realizing that she had never ever known her mother personally, and she felt the emptiness of a space in her heart that would never be filled, for it had always been reserved for her birth mother alone. The two girls in the picture looked decidedly happy. Both were stroking a beautiful horse and smiling brightly into the camera with broad grins. Gemma could not bear to look at the photograph for a moment longer, as the pain seemed to course through her chest like spasms of hot electricity. Her straying thoughts meandered to what could have been, if only her mother were alive. She wondered what kind of relationship they would have enjoyed together. She was certain that, like her close friendship with Estelle, they would have been the very best of friends. But she would never know, as her mother was no longer around. Gemma reluctantly retired back to the wing chair, where Miss Fontaine had beckoned for her to sit. It was rather stiff and uncomfortable, having lost its padded, sumptuous upholstering over the years. She could hear the sound of Miss Fontaine clattering around in the kitchen noisily with crockery. She noticed she was being studied suspiciously by a pair of yellow eyes, glaring at her furiously from a threadbare couch that had been used as a scratching post over the years, and was also draped with another colourful crochet blanket. "What's your name?" whispered Gemma to the cat, who didn't seem remotely amused by her friendly overtures. The tortoise-shell-coloured cat glared at her, growling warningly at her under its breath. It would seem that Miss Fontaine's unfriendliness had certainly rubbed off on her cat, so, like its owner, it did not welcome the presence of strangers in its sumptuous abode. Miss Fontaine entered the living room, carrying a tray that rattled rather precariously in her hands, set with mismatched porcelain cups and saucers, along with a plate of chocolate digestive cookies. With her hands still involuntarily shaking, as if she was unduly nervous about something, Miss Fontaine lowered the tray onto a large square-shaped wrought-iron and wood coffee table, and proceeded to pour Gemma a cup of ginger tea from a teapot that was shaped like a house. Gemma had noticed a display of interesting quirky teapots that were shaped like houses in the far corner of the living room, displayed in a large glass cabinet that were all gathering dust. Miss Fontaine handed Gemma a cup of warm ginger tea, her fingers still trembling. The cat was hunched over, in a pouncing position, facing Gemma, growling warningly at her, oscillating a threatening claw in her direction, as if to say, "Don't you think about getting any closer to me, or I'll rip you apart with my claws." Even though Gemma loved animals, she'd clearly got the message. Some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. "Thank you," said Gemma, taking her cup of tea, rather tentatively, from Miss Fontaine, along with a chocolate digestive cookie. "Don't mind Mary Poppins over there," said the woman, referring to her cat. "She's not used to strangers, I'm afraid." Gemma had gathered as much, and sipped her tea, surprised to find it was absolutely delicious, as the warm taste of ginger spice seemed to taste like sunshine in a cup, and complemented the chocolate digestive beautifully, which Gemma ate hungrily, realizing she'd not eaten any breakfast. If no one were to look at her, she'd have happily dunked the cookie in the warm tea, but Estelle had always warned her that when you were in company, dunking cookies into tea was never advised. "You look a lot like her," said the woman, taking a sip of her own tea from the teacup, rattling it in her hands. "Like who?" asked Gemma. "Your mother, of course," said the woman, studying Gemma curiously through her blue eyes. "It's the lower half of the face, I think, and the eyes." "My dad did tell me I looked a lot like my mother," said Gemma. "When my dad was alive, he was never forthcoming about her, you see. He was rather a closed book as far as my mother was concerned. I regret that he never told me a thing about her. Well, not much. But getting anything out of him was always like extracting blood from a stone. He told me my mother had died in a car accident, and for years I visited an empty gravesite that I thought contained her remains, but it did not. It's a joke to think I'd go to that grave armed with bouquets of roses, and my mother was never actually there. It made me feel close to her going to that gravesite. It was a point of contact, you see. When I buried my father about 2 months ago, I discovered the granite slab that I'd been visiting, dedicated to my mother, was just a memorial stone. That's all it was. And that the burial plot designed for 2 coffins, 2 graves, that is, only contained 1, once my father was put to rest. So I knew then that something was terribly wrong. I found an old newspaper article hidden away in the back of my father's closet, gathering dust and cobwebs, which I so nearly threw away. But I read the articles. They described the car accident on the old Dogwood Road, and my mother's enigmatic disappearance, as my father had kept the truth from me for all those years. My mother could still be alive for all I know, and if she is, I'd like to find her and figure out what actually happened to her on the day of the accident. That's why I came to see you. I was hoping that you might have some answers for me." Miss Fontaine nodded her head. "Ah, so this is all beginning to make a lot of sense to me. You decided to come to this small town of ours to find answers. You read a newspaper report and you jumped to all kinds of wild conclusions. You wanted to find out all about your mother's accident and why she'd disappeared. What is there more to know, young lady? For your information, your mother is definitely deceased. I'm sorry to have to put it to you like that, but she is. I can assure you of this fact. So what more is there to know about it? If you're looking for closure, you've got it. Your mother is dead. I'd advise you to move on with your life, young lady. Your mother would want you to do the same. One thing about Sammy is she didn't believe you should live in the past or the future, but in the very moment that we're living in now. She was always saying that. Don't look back, don't look forward, but live for the moment." "With the greatest of respect, Miss Fontaine, how can you possibly know that my mother is deceased?" asked Gemma. "Do you even know my mother in person? Well, did you know her? You are Violet Fontaine, not Victoria. The article in the newspaper said it was a Victoria Fontaine that was in the accident with my mother, and she was knocked out in the accident, and when she came around, my mother had vanished into thin air. Those were the words she actually used, I believe." Miss Fontaine's teacup rattled in her hands. "You shouldn't believe everything you're told, young lady. Only foolish people do that, you know. They read a paper and they buy into the story as if it's the gospel truth. But they were not there, were they? They never saw what happened. I know what happened. I was there. I am Victoria Fontaine. But after the annoying press kept hounding me at the time, I changed my name to Violet. It was easier that way. Violet is my second name. Your mother, Sammy, was my very best friend.
We were inseparable. I was in a car with her when the accident occurred. So believe me, I know everything that transpired that night. And let me just tell you one thing, young lady. The less you know about the event, the better. Take it from me. All you need to know is that your mother did not survive that grievous accident. I don't want you hanging on to the lost, beleaguered hope that she is still around somewhere, happily living out her life. I certainly wish it was true, but it is not. So it's best to tell you the truth. I know Sammy would not want her own daughter harping over her whereabouts. What good would that do? But I'm sure, even though she's deceased, she's around you all the time, watching over you. As you were the light of her entire life, believe me, I know. I assure you, if she were indeed alive, she'd have never abandoned you for a second. That much I know. She said you were the best thing that happened to her, you know.
So then you do know what happened to my mother? Asked Gemma excitedly. You've got to tell me, Victoria, everything that happened on that night. I've got to know. Don't you think you owe it to my mother to tell me what really happened to her? I'm her daughter. I should know the truth. Violet Fontaine began to shake uncontrollably in her chair, as if she'd taken a ride on a roller coaster. Her teacup continued to wobble precariously in her hands, as if her arm had suddenly been hit by a feisty windstorm. Gemma observed her waxy complexion had become deathly white and almost ghost-like in its colour. Believe me, girl, you don't know what you're asking me. Have you never heard the saying that sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie? Do you know what that means? It means if you wake those dogs up, chaos can ensue, and it can be grievously unsettling for everyone concerned. Sometimes it's best to let things go, to let them just be as they are. Leave them undisturbed. I promise you it's in your best interest to do so. Sometimes ignorance is bliss, and it is in this case. I am very sorry to hear that your father died recently. He was a good man, he really was. I remember him very well. Quiet as a church mouse he was, but such a gentleman. Was it a heart attack? Yes, it was a heart attack. How did you know? Well, I thought as much. Do you know your father was passionately in love with your mother? When you were born, he was as proud as Punch when you graced their lives with your presence. Your mother absolutely knew you were a girl from the very start. She couldn't wipe the smile off your father's face when you were born. He was delighted to have a girl. When Sammy and your father got together, they were inseparable. So after your mother disappeared, he was a notable wreck. I think he'd have probably topped himself if it weren't for you. As so gargantuan was his grief. You were the one thing that kept him sane, kept his feet firmly on the ground. A reason to go on living, I suspect. I knew he would die of a broken heart one day, because in the end it always catches up with you. Grief, I mean. So do yourself a very big favour, young lady. Forget you ever met me. Walk out of my cottage with dignity and grace, knowing your mother is definitely dead. That is all you need to know. I can assure you of that. I'm not leaving your cottage, Violet or Victoria or whatever you call yourself, if you don't tell me what happened on that road. Because if you don't, I'm going to park myself here all day, annoyingly so, until you tell me. And I will refuse to leave. And I'm being deadly serious. Even if your cat, Mary Poppins or whatever you choose to call her, does turn around and scratch me within an inch of my life, I still don't care. I'm not going to budge an inch until you start talking. And I mean business. To Gemma's surprise, the woman chuckled. A tear spilled down her cheek, which she quickly snatched away hurriedly with the back of her long sleeve. Ha! Goodness gracious me! You are funny, Gemma. I'll give you that. You are a carbon copy of your mother. She was as mulishly stubborn as you are, equally as determined. I remember refusing to tell her something once, and word for word she said exactly what you're saying now. Very well.
I'll tell you the entire story. But I promise you one thing. It's not going to be easy to listen to. Look at me. I'm a hermit these days. I live on my own. The people in town think I'm an oddball. And I like it that way, believe it or not. I was never the same after that car accident. It completely shipwrecked my entire life. I never married, never had children of my own, never had a desire to pursue that path, or any other path for that matter. My ambition died with your mother on that night. I was too broken up for all that. When something so dreadful happens, you cannot unsee it, you know. And ever since that harrowing ordeal, my life, it has never been the same. You should go for counselling, said Gemma. That's what people do in New York. It really works. Did your father go for counselling after your mother vanished? Asked Violet quizzically. No, but that's different, said Gemma, shaking her head. My dad, well, he's not, the counselling type. You couldn't exactly drag him to counselling, and you'd have to if you wanted him to go. He'd kick and scream and make such a fuss. It would be impossible to get him to go and have a counselling session. And why is that? Asked Violet. He didn't believe in all that stuff. Well, there you go, then. Neither do I. I'm on the same page as your father there. Do you really think I want to go to a counsellor and harp on and on about the very thing that destroyed my life? I have a brother, who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder after the war in Iraq, in Operation Desert Storm, I believe it was, if my memory serves me correct. Wretched business the whole damn thing was, and I blame the government of the time, sending our boys off to Iraq to get killed or maimed under the guise of removing threatening weapons of mass destruction under Saddam Hussein's regime that never ever existed in the first place. I believe unequivocally it was the quintessential excuse to pilferage the country's oil and wealth, just to make us in America richer, at the expense of losing so many good people. I believe that is what it was all about, and for what. When my poor brother returned home from Iraq, he didn't disagree. He felt as if the army had been used by the powers that be to satisfy their insatiable greed at the cost of their lives. He was a different man, The light in him had burned out. He had seen far too much. That's what war does to you, Ostensibly, the army insisted that for my brother's well-being, he saw one psychologist after another for counselling. And you know what it did for him? Absolutely nothing. It made him go over and over the traumas he had faced in Iraq. In his head, he relived it so graphically, he couldn't take it a moment longer. He told me himself that these so-called experts were doing his head in. I saw how he was after every counselling session. It was as if the therapists were clawing away at an old wound, making it bleed over and over again, getting worse and worse, festering with the infection of my brother's melancholia. It was days later, my poor brother, my beautiful, beautiful brother, with the kindest, most gentle heart. He went and hung himself in a closet. He could bear it no longer. He told me the counselling made it 1,000 times worse. They want me to talk about my feelings, he told me. I don't want to relive the most traumatic event in my entire life. I want to forget it. I don't want to go over the same old ground again and again, like a dog having its nose thrust into its own vomit. I don't want to think about the things we were forced to do, the torture, the barbarity of it all, the lives so needlessly lost. And for what? He was right, and I feel much the same about the accident I experienced on the old Dogwood Road. We were fools going there, your mother and I, but I cannot take back what happened. If I could, I would. I've blamed myself for many years, I should never have listened to your mother, but that's a whole nother story.
I'm so sorry, said Gemma. I had no idea. You've certainly had it terribly rough, and I'm so sorry about your brother's suicide and the sacrifices he made for our country. You're not the only person I've met that believes there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq at the time, and that it was a cunning guise to go into the country to ransack and raid all their oil. Many Americans like myself believe it was to satisfy a gluttonous greed.
Of course there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, said Violet insistently. My brother said as much. I think many people have established that by now. Just think of all the American lives so needlessly lost. It makes me so dreadfully sick.
Violet began to rock up and down in a chair as she reflected over her late brother. Gemma was sure she could see that her eyes were like heavy clouds, eager to burst their banks, but she restrained her tears.
My brother said he saw things in Iraq he could never ever unsee. Stuff he never wanted to talk about, even to me, and we were incredibly close, you know. There was not much he did not tell me. I feel much the same about what happened to me on the old Dogwood Road. I've been spending every day of my life trying to forget all about these things, and your coming here has opened up a whole can of worms for me.
I'm so sorry about that. I really am, Violet. And I'm also sorry that counselling didn't work for your brother. But I do believe it helps some people. I mean, these experts are supposed to know what they're doing. I have a friend who lost her son in a freak accident. She claims the therapist she's seeing saved her life. So what is good for the goose isn't always good for the gander. We're all different, I suspect. What is one man's medicine is another man's poison.
You're very right about that, said Violet ruefully. My brother should never have had counselling. I think if he'd blocked it all away, the bad memories, I mean, at the back of his mind, like an old suitcase that you leave in the attic to gather dust, there is a very strong possibility he'd still be around today. I'm sorry, young lady, but I'm very cynical about the modern world and all its flaky promises. For me personally, I believe in trying to fight the demons from the past on my own. And I'm doing just fine, as you can see.
Gemma did not think that Violet Fontaine was doing particularly well, shutting herself away in a cottage like this, and living like a hermit. But who was she to judge? Maybe the woman, much like her late brother, would be worse off if she had counselling, which certainly did not have appeared to have helped her brother. She did know many people had returned from Iraq, never the same again, having seen things you can't unsee, having witnessed the most brutal side of human nature, and having done things in wartime that no human being would want to ever do. How did you ever get over taking another person's life under the flag of war? It couldn't be easy at the very best of times. All that Gemma did know was that something traumatic had happened to her mother on the old Dogwood Road, and once the mystery was unlocked by the woman who had the key in her hand, who was warning her about opening this mystery box, of skeletons that she had recommended remain buried, there would be no going back. Gemma knew she could get up and leave the cottage like Violet Fontaine had recommended. But what had happened to her mother, Samantha Barton, on the night she appeared to have vanished into thin air? Gemma needed to know the answers to that question. Her need to know was so great she was willing to live with the consequences of an unsavoury knowledge that might jeopardize her peace of mind, as it had done so clearly for Violet Fontaine. Violet put down her teacup onto the coffee table and pulled out some crocheting from a big bag at the bottom of the settee. "I like to crochet," she said. "When I talk, it makes things easier for me." "Go ahead," said Gemma. Violet Fontaine's account of the night on the old Dogwood Road. I remember that dreadful accident on the old Dogwood Road incredibly well. The whole event is so clear it's as if it happened yesterday, and I wish I did not, but there you go. Your mother and I were, as you know, the very best of friends, had been since kindergarten, I think it was. We'd both done a typing and shorthand course together, and had become secretaries. Your mother was brilliant at shorthand, and was earning a good salary, working for a man called Revel Bassett. He was a good man, you know. Originally from Boston, I believed, but moved over here to enjoy the benefits of a quiet Montana town. I can't remember what kind of business it was, but it was something to do with tourism connected to Yellowstone National Park, and raising more awareness to the public, in attracting more foreign visitors to our part of the world. Me and your mother, we'd both meet up after work for a girls' night out
every Friday evening to rewind after a day spent in the office at the local bar in town. It was a traditional thing for us to do. We did it every Friday night without fail. We'd enjoy a bite to eat together, along with a few drinks. Your father always agreed to take care of you, as you were a tiny wee thing back then. Your father was a very considerate gentleman, you know. He'd tell your mother she needed time with her girlfriends, and it was an absolute pleasure for him to look after you. Your parents could afford to hire an au pair to look after you during the day, while they worked, but the au pair your parents hired was never available at night for some very strange reason. I think she had a boyfriend at the time she liked to hang around with. She was quite a little thing in her teens, I believe. It was one day in the bar that we overheard a couple of young men talking about the old Dogwood Road, of all things, and strange things that had happened on that road. So our ears were wagging, eavesdropping onto a conversation we probably should not have listened to. One of the young men was saying that he'd never venture out onto the old Dogwood Road ever again. "Something's not right about that Dogwood Road," he was saying, shaking his head furiously. "I've never believed in all the rumours about the old Dogwood Road. I thought, like any old town, we had our mysterious legends, and I didn't want to be swept away by the whimsical suggestions of a fertile imagination. All my life I've been a perennial cynic, never believed in ghosts or monstrous beasts, but now I beg to differ about all that. I was driving down the old Dogwood Road in the middle of the night. Very dark night it was, too. Inauspicious. Not a good feeling in the air, I have to say. I was listening to the Bee Gees to put me in a good mood on the radio. But I'm telling you, something very bizarre happened. A gust of ice-cold air entered my car, like a large whoosh of energy. It's the only way I can describe it. And all the windows were closed, so I could not explain that experience. It was a warm night, let me tell you, but the temperature in my car plummeted significantly, and I got a profound sense I was not alone, and that someone was sitting right next to me on the passenger seat. It felt like a formidable, menacious presence, sending goosebumps of trepidation trickling down my spine. I absolutely knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was not alone. I put my hand on the seat next to mine. It almost burnt my fingers. I felt like I'd put my hand on an icy block of ice. Oh, my word, there are no words. It freaked the hell out of me. I began to press down the accelerator of my truck as hard as I possibly could to get off the old Dogwood Road. But my truck refused to move forward, and I had a full tank of gas in my car. But the car just did not budge, not even an inch. I couldn't start the engine because it kept dying on me. It would splutter into life and then fade as fast as it started. And I don't mind admitting, I was cursing like a sailor. I was so frustrated. Then I felt someone breathing down my neck with an icy breath. I cannot describe the level of terror I felt. It shot through me. From a 6 to a 10++. I could stand it no longer. I got out of the car, hightailed it down the old Dogwood Road as fast as I possibly could, and all the while something was running behind me, pounding the ground so heavily with ponderous feet. I thought I was being chased by something gargantuan in size. I could hear this sizable invisible entity spluttering and heaving and coughing, gaining ground behind me, getting closer and closer and closer. And I don't mind admitting to you, my life flashed before my very eyes, and for a brief second I genuinely thought my number was up. I got the ominous sense that I was in mortal danger. But I physically could not see a damn thing. Do you have any idea how annoying that is? You know you are being followed, but you cannot see what is following you. But something was there. I could feel it with every fibre of my being. And I did not dare look back. But once I'd left the road and was running through the tall, lofty trees, I took the Croydon trail to the Croydon's farmhouse, which I knew very well. I looked back through the trees, and I saw a pair of yellow eyes at about 8 foot off the ground, staring at me. Nothing else. I didn't see a shape or a size or a thing. I just saw the eyes. I ran to the Croydon farmhouse, and thankfully Dr. Croydon let me in. He's a good man, you know. Gave me some sedatives to calm me down. Insisted I stayed overnight at his farmhouse. There are things out there, he said to me. Things you cannot imagine. You need to stay here overnight. We'll get your truck back in the morning when it's safe. So I agreed to stay overnight. It was his wife, Mary Lou, who fussed around me like a mother hen, saying, "I keep telling people not to venture down the old Dogwood Road, you know, but some people just won't listen. Even when I offer them well-meaning advice, they always think they know better." She asked me if I'd picked up a ghostly female hitchhiker on the Dogwood Road, and was that the reason for my obvious distress. She told me she'd done it before herself, and never again. I chose not to scare her by telling her about my bizarre encounter with a gargantuan invisible energy that had doggedly pursued me down the road. She told me one night she'd returned to the Croydon farmhouse and saw a young girl hitchhiking on the Dogwood Road in the middle of the night. "I was quite confounded," she told me. "I thought to myself, what on earth is a young lady doing on the road in the middle of the night, hitchhiking a lift at this God-forsaken hour, when she's a sitting duck for predators or any weirdos crossing her path with duplicitous intent?" She told me that over the years, with so many visitors visiting Yellowstone National Park, that they'd had their fair share of weirdos passing through her neck of the woods. One of those trespassers, I believe, was a German man who was built like the Incredible Hulk, was shaven like a skinhead, and had tattoos all over his head and his chest. He insisted on camping in their woods, claiming it was a free world, and he could do the hell what he liked, even though the Croydon property is privately owned, as you well know. The following day the Croydons found his camping site in the trees had been abandoned. There was pools of blood lying everywhere. The man was nowhere to be found. The tent looked like it had been put through a paper shredder, and items of the man's camping gear were hanging up in the trees, pots and pans, like Christmas decorations, you know. Suffice to say, they never did find out what happened to him. But it turned out he did return to Germany safe and well. But why he abandoned his stuff, God only knows. And as for the blood at the scene, that's even stranger. But the police inquiries got nothing out of that German tourist, beyond the fact that he'd never set foot in America ever again. It was a weird place, that's what he said. I asked Dr. Croydon's wife to tell me more about this female hitchhiker, because I've heard a lot about her over the years. They say she was killed in the 1960s, I believe. She says the woman was hitching a ride at 12:30 at night. She thought the woman could come to harm, standing there alone like that. I knew I would take her home with me, offer her a bed for the night. I rolled up in my car, like you do, and I killed the engine, and I leaned over to the passenger side door to pull up the knob, telling her to get into the car. She didn't hesitate, you know. It was a freezing cold night, but when the woman entered my car, the temperature got decidedly freezing. I thought I'd walked into a cold box. I was breathing out clouds of white condensation, but this woman was not, you know, and it struck me as decidedly odd. But I remember lecturing her about the dangers of hitchhiking in the middle of the night. She told me she wanted to go to Maggie's. I thought she was referring to a friend's place, not a boarding house that used to exist for backpackers in the 1960s, that has long since closed down. I told her when we got back to my house, she could use our landline to phone her friend Maggie to tell her that she was safe and well, and would see her in the morning. She was so quiet on the journey that I turned around to look at her and discovered she was not there. And then it all came back to me, the memories of the old Dogwood Road and the so-called hitchhiker from the 1960s. And that was when it hit me, like a brick to the head, that I had lifted her ghost. The young man in the bar continued with his story. Mrs. Croydon's story confounded me, I have to say. I didn't meet a female hitchhiker on the old Dogwood Road, but something certainly crossed my path that night that I knew was far from good. The next morning, Dr. Croydon came with me onto the Dogwood Road to retrieve my truck. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. My truck had been violently vandalized, scratched, and all the upholstering ripped and torn out of the seats. Mr. Croydon's words were, "Bloody hell, what happened here?"
Violet paused for a brief moment, leaning forwards to the coffee table to take another sip of her ginger tea that Gemma suspected was now cold. Her body physically stiffened, as if she was not looking terribly forward to delivering the last quarter of her story.
I'm not sure what else the man was saying. His friend kept saying, "My God, that is the most dreadful story I've ever heard. You won't get me venturing down that old Dogwood Road if you paid me $1 million in cash notes." But then the waitress arrived to bring their food over, and the rest of the bleary, distorted conversation somehow got lost in the crossfire, I'm afraid. But me and your mother had become so riveted by what we'd heard about the old Dogwood Road, after eavesdropping on the most fascinating story we'd ever heard. Of course, we'd heard the rumours over the years, the wild speculation about the ghostly spectres said to haunt the old Dogwood Road, but we'd always taken it with a pinch of salt, as you do. But after hearing that young man's absurd account, I hasten to say that both me and your mother were absolutely piqued with curiosity. Sparked, you could say, like a candle that's been lit that you simply can't blow out. Your mother leaned towards me and said, "My God, did you hear all that, Victoria? Can you believe what that guy just said? I'm so glad we had a girls' night out tonight, because that is the most interesting story I've ever heard in my entire life." I nodded. How could I not agree with that? "Do you think it's true?" she asked me excitedly. "Of course it's true," I said. "I don't doubt it for a second. My dad drove down that old Dogwood Road once, and he said every hair was standing up on the back of his neck. So yes, I believe it. I don't think that young man was making it up. Did you hear how shaken he sounded?" Me and your mother became incredibly intrigued after we'd eavesdropped on that very exciting conversation, and we talked about nothing else all evening apart from the paranormal. People think stories of the paranormal have only come to public scrutiny in the last couple of centuries, especially in the advent of all those television programs they air. But I'm here to tell you not so, young lady. That is not the case. When I was growing up, amongst my Nancy Drew novels and Famous Five books, me and all my friends talked about ghosts all the time. We'd go to the library and take out every available book we could find about ghostly hauntings. We were riveted, fascinated about the stuff, by all things unexplained and mysterious. Because I think most people are, you know. Some more than others, of course. I think age has no fading effect on the passion within all of us, to have a glimpse of the mysteries in our world that make life so much more intriguing. Anyway, me and your mother left the bar that night, together, laughing happily as you do, having had perhaps a wee bit too much alcohol to drink. It was a warm night, very pleasant it was, with a cool breeze blowing. I had promised to lift Sammy back to her home. Your mother knew her husband and baby were sleeping very safely back at her house. When I dropped her off, she'd need to enter the house very quietly, so as not to disturb you most especially. Furthermore, your father didn't take very kindly to being woken up in the middle of the night, given he was a light sleeper anyway. So any disturbance in the household would likely jolt you out of your sleep. Your mother said you had a pair of lungs on you that would make a foghorn. Well, would put it to shame, that is. And once you started crying, you were like an air raid siren, and your parents just could not shut you up. So they valued their sleep greatly. Your mother turned around to me in the car and said, "Victoria, please, please, let's go to the old Dogwood Road, just quickly. See if we can see something outer-worldly there. I've always wanted to see a ghost. Go on, it'll be fun. Be a sport." My eyes widened, I have to say. I looked at your mother as if she'd lost leave of her senses. "Are you for real?" I said dubiously. "You heard what that young man had to say about the bodeful encounter he had on the old Dogwood Road, and you seriously think we should venture out there in the middle of the night?" "Oh, go on, Victoria. You know you want to," your mother said to me. "It's going to be fun. We're in this together in the car. What's the worst that could happen to us? Being scared out of our wits. And that's part of the fun, is it not?" "But I do think it's a big deal," I said. "Being scared, I mean." One thing about your mother, young lady, was she was mulishly stubborn and resolutely determined. Very persuasive she was, much like yourself. For if that were not the case, I would not be sharing the intricacies of this bizarre story with you. Your mother artfully persuaded me that a brief trip down the old Dogwood Road would not harm us in the slightest. Her reasoning made perfect sense to me, because lots of people have travelled down that old Dogwood Road in the middle of the night, experiencing no issues whatsoever. So why should it be any different for us? Reluctantly, I agreed to your mother's dogged requests. Why not, I thought to myself. At the end of the day, is it really such a big deal? And Sammy's absolutely right. If we were to encounter something bizarre on the old Dogwood Road, we'd have a marvellous story to tell of our own. All right, I said to her. We'll go down the Dogwood Road. And you know what your mother said to me. "I know now why you're my best friend, Victoria. You're always open to having a good time. That's what I've always liked about you." I do remember it was an inauspiciously dark night, despite the pleasant weather we'd been having, and your mother enjoyed the fact that it was creepy. I think she took a kind of macabre pleasure from being moderately spooked, as if it kind of gave her a little thrill, like some people get from bungee jumping or throwing themselves out of a plane in a parachute. "Oh, my goodness, it's so dark out there," she said, as we took a casual spin down the road, which, let me tell you, was precariously bumpy. We were jolting around like rice in a child's rattle, which gave your mother an attack of the giggles. "I can hardly see anything," she said. "Thank God for your headlights, Victoria, lighting up the way so generously. Or I guess we wouldn't see a thing at all, would we? I don't even see any stars out tonight, and as for the moon, it's clearly had a bad hair day and decided not to show its face. Maybe it's had an outbreak of acne and has got all bashful," she teased. It was true, of course. The sky looked like a dark velvety veil that had not yet been adorned with any rhinestone jewels, so to speak. I will admit it was hauntingly spooky, no doubt about that, driving down a tenebrific road fringed by large congregations of tall, lofty trees that looked ambiguously obscure in the dancing shadows. almost like menacing hooded giants that could pounce out at you with a gnarled woody hand and grab you unaware. Your mother was making all those spooky noises to entertain us. Ooh, ooh. She was game for a good laugh and had a fabulous sense of humour, you know. But as we were driving down the old Dogwood Road, your mother screamed, "Stop! Stop! A deer! You're going to hit him! You've got to stop, Victoria!" I tried to swerve out the way as this huge, giant-like deer rocketed past our car. To date, I have never seen a more magnificent deer. Everything about him was built on a larger scale. His body, his magnificent antlers that were absolutely enormous. I'll never forget those black startled eyes. Filled with fear they were, staring at us, looking back onto the road as if it was terrified that something was pursuing it. A predator, perhaps. I'm not sure how I lost control of the car, but I did. The only way I can describe it, it felt almost as if it was yanked off the ribbon of the road by a large invisible hand. The next thing I knew is my car went veering off the road straight into a tree, and I remember hearing your mother's frantic screams, and for a moment I almost blacked out myself. I was swung violently forward in my seat, and the airbags were released. There was a mighty crash as we slammed violently into the tree, and for the moment I did actually think I was facing the end of my life, but was remarkably surprised to find that even though the car was a complete write-off, me and your mother were very much alive and in one piece. But it felt like one of my legs and a foot was trapped under the folds of the metal, because I couldn't pull it away, which was very disturbing indeed.
"Bloody hell!" said Sammy. "I can't believe that happened. Are you all right, Victoria?" "I think so," I said. "My foot is stuck under this metal here. I can't pull it out, and it really hurts. A bit of my leg is stuck there as well." We were both staring out at the trees on the edge of the road in abject astonishment. We knew in that moment we were very lucky to be alive, that was for sure. Your mother was breathing heavily to steady her nerves, I suspect, while I broke out into a clammy, nervous sweat. "Did you see the size of that deer?" said Sammy, looking at me with shiny eyes. "I could see it was frightened by something. Poor thing! Don't feel sorry for the deer. Look at us. At least it's alive and well. But we're caught up in this wreck of a car and we need to get out. I cannot move my foot. I'm stuck. You're going to have to get out of the door. Walk over to the Croydon farmhouse to get help for us. I think there's a footpath through the trees somewhere around there." All of a sudden, something very strange happened. I don't think airy is a word to qualify for how bodefully haunting everything became. A wind whistled menacingly through the trees, brazenly shaking the branches, and then a mist seemed to creep across the ground, spreading thickly like icing on a cake, or like dry ice spreading its thick foggy veil across a dance floor at a wedding. But it soon took over everything, so that all we saw in our car was a dense, cloying mist. Suddenly it seemed that the moon re-emerged from its hiding place, as the road was lit up in a silvery bluish light. And there, in that foggy mist, we saw this hideous, grotesque, gargantuan silhouette. A dark, ambiguous figure it was, with monacious yellow eyes, glowering at us through this thick, obscure curtain of mist. Me and your mother began to tremble violently, like two shaking trees hit hard by a spirited tornado. Your mother was saying, "What the hell is that in the mist?" We knew we should get out of the car, but my foot was stuck beneath crushed metal, and your mother didn't want to leave me on my own. Thankfully, we did not smell any gas or observe any smoke coming from the engine of the car. But it's very easy after an accident, you know, for a car to catch a light. But nothing like that happened. The mist was crawling and creeping all over the car, like white waves thrashing violently against a small little island.
We couldn't see a thing, I remember that. And then slowly and surely the mist began to dissipate. But the troubling thing was we knew, absolutely unequivocally, that there was something menacious in that mist. And we weren't wrong. There standing before us was the most monstrous beast that I have ever beheld.
"A beast?" gasped Gemma. "What kind of a beast are you talking about?"
"That's the problem,"
said Violet, beginning to shake like a leaf, as she reluctantly described the creature she and Sammy had seen on the old dogwood road.
"It was like something the bowels of hell regurgitated, like unwanted waste matter from the sewage pipes of hell itself. The first thing I recall is the repugnant, cloying, sulphurous smell. It stole your breath away, it did. So it stung my lungs, along with the back of my throat. It was an acrid, acid stench, reminiscent of death and decay, intermingled with rotting garbage. The creature was tall, lofty, lanky, easily 7 to 8 foot tall, sinewy, rather muscular, with ribs that clawed through its flesh. The creature looked like it had been attacked by the mange. There were bald patches of its hair, which was short and dense, exactly the same golden brown and black colour you would find of a German shepherd dog. This insidiously macabre creature looked exactly like something drawn up by the fictitious imagination of Universal Studios for the purposes of a horror movie, designed to rob every man and woman of a peaceful night's sleep. For believe me, my dear, if you saw this thing in your dreams, you'd never ever sleep again. This creature was half wolf and half human, with a monstrously intimidating muzzle. Never seen anything like it before. Exactly like a wolf. There were 2 rows of canine teeth, without exaggeration, that were grinning at us through his jaws. He was menacing. I've never beheld such a gargantuanly disgusting creature in all my life. And he was drooling over us, as if salivating over a meal. There were globlets of spittle, as gelatinous as aloe vera gel, blobbing out of its mouth and congealing on the ground. There were patches of dried blood like jam on a kid's face, stuck messily to the short hair on either side of its muzzle. And I noticed some downy white bird feathers stuck in its hair. I'll never forget those menacious eyes, dark and purple, like that of a raven's feathers. But it was like there was no reflectant light in those eyes, no glimmer of compassion, no humanity. It was like they were devoid of anything remotely good. The creature stood up on its hind legs, walking much like a man, swinging its arms very nimbly. I did notice it had clawed hands with jagged nails that were as sharp as razor blades, capable of inflicting great damage. Of that I was in no doubt. It also had a very bushy tail, I noticed. It was swinging backwards and forwards as it moved, rather like a pendulum, as if slightly inebriated. I think it was just excited by the sight of us, as if just looking at us was giving him a euphoric high of a kind. For a moment I do remember being locked under his gaze, as if I was being tossed around in pools of dark black water that was beginning to drown me and swallow me whole. It was the most horrifying feeling. Your mother screamed at me to get out of the car and to run, but I couldn't go anywhere. I was trapped in the car. I was certain that I was going to be this creature's next meal, but I underestimated the creature's desire to chase his food and the thrill of the hunt. The creature adopted the instincts of a lion or even a domestic tabby, toying with a mouse, subjecting it to much teasing torture. This insidious thing did not want its meal delivered on wheels, which is a human inclination, is it not? Convenience and practicality when it comes to our food. No, that was too easy for this creature. He wanted a great deal of fun. He could have grabbed me out of the car, extracting me like a sardine from a tin. But no, that was far too boring for him, far too efficiently easy. He could have devoured me in a heartbeat if that were the case. But no, I imposed absolutely no challenge to him. Your mother made one grievous mistake when she opened the car door, which, despite being so buckled, did actually open. Your mother ran as fast as the wind, and the hideous creature gave her chase as if it was a fabulous game. I was sitting there, of course, with my foot stuck beneath the folds of protruding metal, being unable to help her at all. Your mother was in a dreadful place. I did blow the horn over and over again to scare off this creature, but my actions appeared to excite him all the more, making the chase even more fun for him. Your mother was no match for this thing. It caught up to her so effortlessly, with the fluidness of silk, and a triumphant, smug look on its hideously ugly face. He threw your mother onto his shoulders like a dead-beat sack of potatoes, and then he stood there staring at me triumphantly, where I was sitting in the car watching everything, and he was enjoying my fear, practically basking in it, as if he was sunning himself on a tropical island. Your mother was screaming, kicking, and fighting back. I'll give her that. But this ghastly thing held her hostage on his shoulders with one powerful, strong, clawed hand, as if she weighed no more than a feather. Then the most extraordinary thing happened. The mist reappeared and circumnavigated the entire car, weaving its vaporous threads across the road, like an ethereal tapestry made up entirely of mist. The creature vanished, dematerialized, and after that I blacked out. I'm not exactly sure what happened. My head did not get injured in that collision. I think I must have just passed out from the shock of it all. It was hours later that I was woken up by a firefighter, cutting me out of the wreckage, asking me if I was all right. I remember it was no longer dark, so I must have been asleep or knocked out in that car all night, without remembering a thing, until someone discovered my car on the old Dogwood Road and immediately called the emergency services for help. I'm still amazed that that monstrous creature did not come back to devour me. But I'll tell you one thing, it still haunts my darkest nightmares, and sometimes I wonder if that is the very reason it didn't devour me, so that I could continue to live in fear, long after that experience, because my life has never been the same again, since that fateful day.
So that creature took my mother away? Asked Gemma, unable to believe what she was hearing. Of all the stories that Violet Fontaine could have potentially told her of her mother's mysterious vanishing, this was not what she was expecting to hear. Violet nodded her head solemnly, her eyes clouded over by tears, her body shuddering.
I'm afraid so. I warned you, young lady, that this story was not going to be easy for you to hear, nor has it been easy for me to tell. For a long time I persuaded myself I had imagined the whole thing that happened on the old Dogwood Road, but I assure you, this was no illusory dream. I've never been inspired by a rich imagination. Even the teachers at school when I was growing up described my redundant essays as lacking both depth and imagination. Of course, I told my father the story. He absolutely believed me. He told me to keep stum. People might think I needed psychiatric help and had lost leave of my senses, so I couldn't tell people what had really happened. I hasten to say, the reporters that investigated the accident were told exactly what I've told everybody over the years, that Sammy had vanished from the car like a wisp of smoke. It was so much better that way. I even told your father the very same story. I couldn't possibly tell him the truth. I figured that in this macabre case, the not knowing was infinitely kinder. I'm in no doubt your mother was eaten by that ghastly creature, so she is almost certainly dead.
Violet shuddered, closing her eyes tightly, as if desperately trying to fight away the roaring, obstreperous waves of a tempestuous memory that had successfully shipwrecked her entire life and drowned all her dreams and aspirations, so they sank to the bottom of the ocean, like the last remaining dregs of the Titanic.
Now you can see why I was terribly reluctant to share this story with you. But you insisted on hearing it, so I told you. But one thing I did learn about that incident, I learned to respect that there are things in this world you just don't want to mess with, which is why I decided to live a peaceful, very quiet, sequestered life. I think some reporters did gleam I knew more than I was willing to tell, but they never ever got a bean out of me.
I don't know what to say, said Gemma. I'm just so astonished by what you've told me. It's not what I expected to hear by any manner of means.
I'm sorry, dear. I told you, it's not easy to listen to a story like that.
Believe it or not, Violet, as hard as it might be to believe, I'm very glad you shared it with me. And you are right, my mother is almost certainly dead. But do you know what? I feel a sense of peace knowing what really happened to her. I can't imagine what she went through in those final moments. But if she was pumping enough adrenaline at the time, it might have made the pain more bearable for her, whatever that thing did to her. But I'm glad that right now she's at peace, and in the end, that's all that matters, really.
You're right about that. I try to persuade myself that all the time. Your mother is at peace now. We mustn't forget that.
After Gemma thanked Violet for her time, she wobbled back to the old station wagon on unsteady legs, like an inebriated drunk, unable to comprehend why her legs were crumbling beneath her. It would seem the paralyzing shock of Violet's stunning revelations had hit her grievously hard, like a violent slap across the face, so she felt like an office desk globe that had somehow become dislodged from its axis and crash-landed on the floor. All she wanted to do was to return to the cabin, block out the entire world, while melancholically brooding over everything that Violet had told her, in a quiet contemplation, while knocking back a bottle of Bollinger to anaesthetize the stunning shock of it all. Nothing had prepared Gemma for the cat out of the bag that Violet would unleash in her story, and this one almost certainly had sharp nails that had slashed right through her unapologetically, as images of her mother being carried away on a wolf-like humanoid shoulders to her imminent demise sent dreadful chills prickling down her spine. No wonder Violet had retreated into her own little world, after having come face to face with such a treacherous evil. By all accounts, despite everything that Gemma had learnt about what really had happened to her mother that day, the day that she wistfully just disappeared into thin air, knowing the truth, no matter how dreadful, did bring her a sense of closure, the closure she desperately sought, and for that she was most grateful. She decided she'd enjoy a lazy day back at the cabin, as the idea of doing anything would be far too taxing, as her energy felt as drained as an empty gas tank. She felt as ready to collapse as an old portable camping chair, desirous to just fold up and remain inconspicuously hidden away in a dark corner. Gemma parked the old station wagon by the cabin, eager to retreat into the cosy confines of the cocoon of safety that the wooden walls invited, and the salient, soothing promises that she'd be left well alone, nestled between the sweet sounds of the woodgrove and the tall, lofty trees that upholstered the cabin from every side, like towering centurions watching over her protectively. The woodgrove was tranquil and serene, the trees swishing gently in a cool breeze that blocked out the warmth of the day, like large verdant umbrellas, and despite the weight of Gemma's lugubrious melancholia, she was able to acknowledge how incredibly beautiful everything was. Gemma did not feel like moving a muscle when she entered the cabin. She threw herself lackadaisically across the comfortable couch, with the full intention of parking herself there all day, like a lazy cat, basking in the privilege of doing nothing at all. She began indulging in one glass of Bollinger after another, and for once in her life she took no stock of how much alcohol she was actually ingesting. And quite frankly, she was beyond caring. She had never been much of a drinker, but the wine anaesthetized her raw emotions and made digesting the harrowing bitter news about how her mother had come to an end a whole lot easier to stomach. Gemma was in no doubt the story Violet had told her was the God-honest truth. No one could make up a story like that. The truth could be stranger than fiction. She wondered how anyone in their right mind could venture on the old Dogwood Road after having heard a story like her mother had overheard that night in the bar all those years ago. It brought to mind the saying, "Curiosity killed the cat." And unlike a cat, her mother regretfully did not have 9 lives. She wondered what would have happened if her mother had not run from this insidious beast in the way she did. Would she still be here today? Would the beast have grown restlessly bored if her mother had remained in that car, like a mouse playing dead under a cat's demanding paws? She would never know the answer to that enigmatic question, but she secretly suspected the cunning, crafty beast would have terrorized the 2 women to provoke them to fear, so that her mother would have been forced to run away, and then he'd have given her chase to satisfy his drive for a thrill. She was glad she'd come to Montana, and that Violet had opened up to her in the way she did. But right now her raw emotions were seesawing up and down, as she tried to make sense of everything. Gemma barely remembered the day, as she had drunk so much alcohol. It was a struggle even to stagger to the bathroom. The heaviness had lifted off her, as the alcohol had brought on an attack of the giggles, and she couldn't help herself just laughing at everything, because everything suddenly became terribly, terribly funny. She found herself laughing at the cheese in the refrigerator that looked like it was shaped like a dog, and laughing hysterically when by mistake she boiled the socks instead of the pasta quills she had been intending to eat. It would seem her memory of the afternoon was all but an ambiguous blur, of which she could not remember very much. She awoke in the cabin to be greeted by the soft light of the oil lamp burning on the coffee table and casting soft shadows over the cabin. Gemma glimpsed the clock hanging on the wall above the mantel and gasped. It was 12:10 at night, and she had only had brief flashbacks of the previous day and her visit to Violet Fontaine's cottage. Most of her memories were obliterated by the dulling effects of the alcohol she had ingested that seemed to wipe away all the imprints of the day, which had become hazy and obscure, as if she was trying to look back at them through a misted glass pane. She realized she must have slept for many hours. She was still not in her right mind, as the alcohol had softened the sharp edges of her common sense and dulled her emotional trepidation, so she felt tranquilized and pleasingly calm. Gemma got to her feet, pleased to discover that her legs felt less ethereal and that her balance was reasonably good, as much of the alcohol had been metabolized by her system. But she was still not out of the woods yet. There was enough alcohol in her system to blur her common sense and her sound reasoning. "I should go and visit the old Dogwood Road, get a feel for the place," she told herself. "It will give me a sense of what my mother experienced on that treacherous night, when the hands of fate conspired against her so callously." If Gemma had been completely sober, her thinking would not have opened up into a labyrinth of strange ideas, which in her rational thinking she would have considered absolutely insane. But tonight, going back to the old Dogwood Road like a crime scene investigator seemed like a rather good idea. Gemma grabbed her torch impulsively and put on a pair of jogging pants and a sweater along with a pair of hiking boots, and armed with her torch to the ready, she scrambled out of the cabin at the dead of night, paying no heed to the warnings from Mrs. Tansey, telling her that it was not advisable to go out at night in the woods. Mrs. Tansey had told her if she walked through the trees, she'd come to the old Dogwood Road. Gemma was not entirely certain what it was she wanted to see on the old Dogwood Road, with its ominous haunted reputation. She wasn't hoping to spot the ghostly female hitchhiker trying to get a ride from an unsuspecting driver, nor did she want an encounter with an ambiguous figure in the mist. But maybe what she really wanted was a glimpse of the road upon where her mother had last been seen alive. If there were any warnings lighting up Gemma's head, she neither saw them or gave them any attention. Instead, she giggled as she meandered through the woods, realizing she wasn't exactly as steady on her feet as she first believed. But it didn't matter, did it? The more she walked, the steadier she'd become. It was a fabulously beautiful night. Even Gemma had to admit that. The weather was pleasingly warm, The footpaths were generously spread out and clearly marked, and wide enough to walk through the trees without being rudely scratched by unsuspecting branches or uncongenial thorny briars. It was cloyingly dark and very oppressive under the vast canopy of the trees that were clustered tightly together like a vast army battalion. Somehow, with the light of her torch and the soft, gentle prisms of pretty moonlight that danced through the trees, it was not as daunting as it could have been. Gemma found herself being eaten alive by mosquitoes that seemed to be smacking against her skin, delighting in the taste of her blood. But she noticed them not. She ambled through the trees steadily, occasionally kicking up leaves and twigs, and sometimes tripping over a gnarled root or two that trespassed through the earthen floor. But every time she fell over, she scrambled awkwardly back onto her feet, brushing away the dirt and leaves from her jogging pants. When Gemma was in a sober state, she'd never have even contemplated an adventure like this in the middle of the night. But it would seem being slightly tipsy had made her muscles more loose, so falling over didn't hurt quite so much, which is why drunken people fare a lot better in car accidents, due to their relaxed muscles. Gemma, who was normally intimidated by the dark, felt no fear as she pursued her quarry with a boundless enthusiasm. Finally the trees opened up like a dispersing crowd, and then there she was standing on a long dirt road that looked old, forsaken and forgotten, as if it hadn't been used in a long, long time, possibly because of its haunted reputation. The full moon lit up the road in prisms of soft light, so that any ambiguous shadows from the trees became less obscure. Gemma meandered down the road and giggled, because it was so ordinary. Yes, it looked sequestered. Yes, it looked lonely, but there was nothing outer-worldly or idiosyncratic about it. She walked past the trees fringing the road on both sides, looking for any signs of a damaged tree that might bear the indelible scarring of having been hit hard by a car over 30 long years ago. But all the trees in the lights of her torch didn't appear to be wearing any harrowing scars that hinted of a head-on collision with a car. Surely she'd be able to see signs of damage in the bark. But Gemma saw nothing. No telltale markers in the trees at any place along the road. She was sure if she found the tree it would make her feel close to her mother, as incongruous as that might sound. Gemma had not thought to ask Violet about the tree that the car had bludgeoned into on that inauspicious night. All of a sudden Gemma froze to the spot, when she realized suddenly, very sharply, that she was not alone, that something was watching her. And this spooky realization sent prickles of dread crawling down her spine. She could hear the sound of forest litter being pulverized beneath ponderous feet. She heard the crackle and rustling sounds of leaves being assaulted by heavy kicks, and the snapping sounds of twigs. Something was in the trees. Something was watching her. She had the profound sense that she was being scrutinized. In a trice, Gemma became incredibly sober, as she suddenly became profoundly aware of her own fragility and vulnerability. What on earth was she doing here? Why had she come out onto this country road in the middle of the night? Was she stark raving mad? As a whoosh of common sense flooded her reasoning, like a blinding light, she saw an ambiguous dark shadow emerging through the trees, lunging towards her with huge, powerful strides, and for a brief moment she froze to the spot, as the creature roared, standing on the fringes of the road, glaring at her furiously through enraged yellow eyes. She was staring at a Bigfoot. She'd heard of these creatures before, but seeing one in the flesh larger than life was hard to physically digest. And this horrifying creature, standing on tree-trunk-sized legs, at about 9 foot tall and 800 pounds, was possibly the most terrifying thing she'd ever beheld. His burly, robust body was covered with purple-black hair, the colour of a raven's feathers. The Bigfoot roared and thrashed his chest with an unbridled indignance. It would seem he was enraged with Gemma, as if she'd trespassed onto private property and offended him greatly, and all of a sudden he began to give her chase. She thought about how her mother's running had been her undoing, But Gemma could not help herself. She had to run away from this Bigfoot, or she was certain she was dead. The Bigfoot was not chasing her because he was thrilled by her fear. He was chasing her because she had ventured where she was not wanted. And that was the difference. Gemma's reluctant legs, like a rusty, degraded farm tractor that had not been used in decades, sprang into action as she ran aimlessly into the woods, following the footpath towards the cabin. The Titanic-sized creature trailed behind her, kicking the ground furiously with his continuingly powerful strides, that much like loose floorboards, everything in the woodgrove groaned and shook under his formidable weight. This large, imposing Bigfoot was breathing heavily, heaving and spluttering, as it chased her through the trees. It moved with a powerful, nimble gait, with effortless grace and ease, while Gemma's feet were slow on the uptake, so she still did not know how she managed to get back to the cabin in time. But she realized she hadn't locked the door, so she hurriedly scrambled inside, closing it behind her as hard as she could. With trembling hands, she managed to double-bolt it, and with a pounding heart that was doing a series of jumping jacks in her chest, and with laboured breathing, she sank to the ground beneath the door. She could hear the Bigfoot thundering very loudly around the cabin, as if he wanted her to know that he was still out there. She was terrified he'd break down the door, grab her, ferry her away to meet a similar deadly fate that had met her own mother. Gemma screamed when she realized that the Bigfoot's face was pressed against the window pane, and he was looking in directly at her. But to her amazement, his eyes did not appear to be mean or unkind. To Gemma's surprise, the Bigfoot walked away and continued to march around the cabin all night. Gemma awoke to find herself lying in a slumped heap on the floor. When she arose from her sleep, she wondered if the idiosyncratic events of the previous night had been real. Surely they'd been an unfortunate dream. But when she saw the dreadful state of her clothing, the leaves and the mud sticking to her shoes, she realized what had transpired had indeed been real. Gemma wasted no time peeking through the window to see if the Bigfoot was still patrolling the cabin, but she was delighted to see he was long gone. But what she did find on the front doorstep was a pretty blue stone, which she slipped into her pocket. Gemma could not stay in the cabin a moment longer. She threw all her belongings together into a suitcase very speedily, and left a note for Mrs. Tansey, apologizing that her time at the cabin had been cut short, as she needed to return to New York urgently. Gemma called the taxi driver, and the very same thin man that had initially taken her to the cabin arrived to pick her up. He did not speak to her as he put her suitcase in the back of his trunk. Gemma knew she looked like she'd been dragged through a hedge backwards, but she didn't care. She could not get to the airport fast enough to get the hell away from this Montana town. Gemma nonchalantly pulled the blue stone out of her jean pocket to examine it closely in her fingers, and to her surprise, the taxi driver who'd been watching her through the visor mirror suddenly stopped his car and turned around to look directly at her. "Where did you get that stone from?" he asked her. "I found it on my doorstep," she said. "Well, the doorstep of the cabin. Why do you ask?" "That is a solar stone," said the taxi driver. "My grandmother was given one once by a Bigfoot, you know. Those stones are used for protection, to keep you safe from evil, I'm told. My grandmother was given one because her husband, my grandfather, was beating her up very badly. She met a Bigfoot who told her to keep the stone, and my grandfather left her after that. Never touched her again, you know. The stone worked. I just don't understand what one is doing in your possession. They're quite rare, you know." Gemma was not about to confide in the taxi driver, but she realized in that poignant moment that maybe the Bigfoot that had chased her into the woods from the road had done so because she was in grievous danger, and then he'd marched around the cabin to keep her safe, and he'd left her a stone for protection. But one thing Gemma knew for certain: she'd keep the stone, but never again return to the old dogwood road. Some cans of worms should never be opened for good reason. So there you are. That's my story. Well, what can I say? Isn't that the most incredible story? I loved every minute of it. What a fabulous story. And incredible things that happened on that old Dogwood Road. I can't help wondering if that's a portal where all these strange, mysterious things happen. You know, a bit like a Bermuda Triangle on a road, so to speak. But anyway, what an incredible, incredible story. And let's just say, I do think that Gemma was being protected by that Bigfoot who she thought was pursuing her for evil means, when perhaps he was actually trying to protect her. Sometimes we can get the wrong impression about things.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.